What's going on, guys? Today we're going to theorize how things would have changed if Erwin inherited the Colossal during Season 3 of Attack on Titan. As we all know, Levi's choice to give this shifter to Armin was a big surprise, even to the freaking people who wanted it to happen, and in Erwin's absence, Hanji became the newest leader of the Survey Corps. Over the following years, they did learn a lot about the outside world, but failed to take significant steps when it came to protecting the island, frustrating Erwin so much that he met Yelena in secret, infiltrated Mali without permission, and then started a civil war when he returned to Paradis. In my opinion, many of those things wouldn't have happened if Erwin survived, because he usually had a solid plan for any situation, meaning if he was alive, he could have found an alternate path for survival that no one thought of in the main show. This video is part 1 of a new series that will examine this alternate reality, but before we get into it, I'm giving away one Funko of the Commander himself, and all you have to do to enter is simply sub to the channel and leave a comment below. The winner will be chosen at random using commentpicker.com and will be announced during part 2 of this series next month, but remember, you have to be subbed if you want your comment to have a chance. Okay, so the best place to start this video off is when Levi was about to give Erwin the injection, because the syringe was literally in his arm, and realistically speaking, all Levi had to do was push down. In the original timeline, the captain paused at this moment, as he briefly thought about Armin's dream to reach the sea, but more importantly, he also thought about the wise words of his favourite uncle. According to Kenny Ackerman, all humans need something to chase after, or else there'd be no reason to keep on living, and for Erwin, his motivation was to avenge his father's death by uncovering the truth about the world. Earlier, he'd mentioned how this was more important to him than the survival of humanity, but as the commander of the Survey Corps, he was backed into a corner where he really had to give up on his dream to defeat the Beast Titan. He knew the scouts wouldn't charge at Zeke unless he was leading them, and it was thanks to Levi's harsh words that Erwin accepted it was time for his dream to die. This acceptance of his dream being over is a major factor in why the captain decided not to bring him back, but in this alternate timeline that obviously can't happen. For argument's sake, let's just say Levi no longer hesitates at the crucial moment, and turns the commander into a pure Titan straight away like he intended. Following that transformation, Erwin will wake up many hours later having eaten Bertolt, and the first thing he'd notice is the brand new right arm that would have grown while he was asleep. This arm was bitten off by a random Titan in Season 2, but with it returning, he would instantly realize that he's now become a Titan shifter. As with most people who gain these abilities, the commander would have no memory of the events surrounding it, so for all he knows he could be the new Beast Titan, the new Armor Titan, or even the new Cart Titan, he genuinely just have no idea. Levi would likely be the one to update him on everything that happened, and once that's explained, they'd set out to find the Jaeger family basement, with Mikasa and Eren leading the way. While I think Eren would be a complete mess thanks to Armin's death, back in Trust, Mikasa did show composure when it comes to this kind of thing, so I feel like she'd be able to calm him down and refocus him on the task at hand. Obviously, you could argue that she wasn't that composed a few hours earlier, but with Armin now actually being gone, I feel like she'd accept there's nothing they can do to bring him back. After searching the basement long enough, they'd eventually find the 3 hidden notebooks left behind by Grisha Jaeger, and this discovery would be the culmination of Erwin's dream. As he said, he had to be there when they learned the truth about the world, and now having learned that truth, he'd realized their enemy is a massive nation that wants to steal the founding Titan. Because Mali failed in their mission, everyone would know they will return at some point to try and capture Eren, so strengthening the island's defenses becomes his new top priority. Over the course of the next few days, Naldok would apologize to Erwin for never taking his theory seriously when they were younger, while separately, Eren and Mikasa would still be made to serve a short jail sentence for trying to give Armin the injection. The time would then come for the leaders of Paradis to decide what they should do with Grisha's notebooks, and of course this is a perfect opportunity for Erwin to give one of his classic speeches, something about how the truth needs to be made public or else all those deaths would be for nothing. Just like in the original timeline, it's likely that during this meeting Eren would realize how to access the Founder's power, but Eren being Eren, he'd stay quiet because he wouldn't want to risk his story being turned into a Titan, especially now that he's already lost one of his closest friends. Anyway, the contents of Grisha's notebooks would then be released in the newspaper a day later, revealing the truth about the world to the people of the island. The release of this information would also serve a secondary purpose for the commander, as he would be starting a recruitment drive to rebuild the Survey Corps to numbers never seen before. When you combine high public morale with the charisma of a leader like Erwin, thousands of regular civilians could be convinced to become new recruits, while hundreds of existing soldiers would defect to join the scouts. Nal in particular is someone who I think would leave the MPs to join the Survey Corps ranks, as after everything that went down, I think he'd want to follow his old friend for whatever's about to happen. In the months after this, Erwin would spend time revamping what the Survey Corps are about, slowly turning them into an army that's more prepared to fight back against an invasion. All the soldiers who recently joined from other military branches would now be trained to use Thunder Spears, while the fresh recruits would mainly focus on how to kill humans and Titan shifters. This type of evolution is a logical step that I think Erwin would take, as in the past he mentioned how he viewed the scouts as a spear made to eliminate threats. Given that Mali's biggest threat comes from their shifters and the humans who might be helping them, it only makes sense that the scouts would need to move on from their old ways of thinking. While all of this training is going on, the Executioner from Hell would be systematically wiping out most pure Titans on Paradis, and by the winter, 99.9% of them would be gone. Fast forward to the spring, and the scouts would conduct their first expedition to the sea, with the commander planning to construct a military base where the Malian wall currently stands. He'd know that when Mali returns, they'll likely come to this location, given that, they made it themselves, so the idea would be for the base to be fortified with weapons, and have at least one Titan shifter present at all times. Later that same year, while the base is under construction, Mali would send their first fleet of survey ships to inspect the island, and on board would be Yelena, Onyankopon, and a very suspect amount of Malian wine. In the main show, the arrival of Zeke's anti-Malian volunteers caused a serious debate, with certain people believing they should all be executed, while others like Hanji believing that the volunteers could be useful. When it comes to Erwin, I think he'd initially be somewhere in the middle, cause on the one hand, after seeing what Zeke did to the scouts, there's no way he'd believe the Beast Titan suddenly wants to help the same people he killed. The commander would probably think that the volunteers are part of some kind of trick to steal the Founding Titan, a sentiment that was shared by Zachary as well. On the other hand, Erwin would also realize that these guys can provide technology and knowledge that they can't get anywhere else, so it could be a mistake to not use that to their advantage. For that reason, I think that working carefully with the volunteers is a gamble the commander would be willing to make, because the benefits will outweigh the costs as long as they can keep the Founding Titan safe. Now, for those of you that maybe forgot, when Yelena arrived, she instantly revealed a lot of important information about Mali, including the size and structure of their army, the type of weapons they use, and the development of their airships. On top of that, one of the more interesting things she says that often gets overlooked was that Mali couldn't invade Paradis at this time, largely because they were involved in a completely different war. After losing the female and Colossal Titans, they were perceived as weak by other countries, and so Mali's many enemies gathered together to try and take them out. In the original timeline, this was mentioned once by Yelena and never spoken of by Hanji again, but for someone like Erwin, he'd see the war as a chance to crush their biggest enemy. He said himself that his goal after reaching the basement would be to eliminate threats on the other side of the walls, and with the right strategy, the Mideast War provided a perfect battleground to wipe out Mali and potentially make allies at the same time. Hear me out on that one. While it's true the entire world seriously hates Paradis, based on everything we know, you could argue the Malian military is almost equally as hated. For 100 years, they used Titan shifters to dominate the planet, invading countless countries along the way and forcing civilians like Onyankopon to join their army. Many of those victories were only possible thanks to the Titans, so it's fair to say that if the warriors could somehow be eliminated, then Mali would very probably lose the Mideast War. In the main series, we saw how the Mideast Alliance was beaten thanks to the Beast and Armored Titans, but in this alternate timeline, Erwin's new strategy could destroy the warrior unit before this even happens. In doing that, they could change how millions of people around the world perceive Paradis, and while it wouldn't magically stop prejudice against Eldians, at the very least it could allow the island to make allies with the Middle East. Obviously, there are a lot of steps that need to happen for this to be a possibility, because for a start, it would take some serious convincing for the Alliance to put aside their prejudice and accept help from the Scouts. I know some of you watching might even think it's just impossible for that to happen, but when it comes to war, certain countries are willing to win by whatever means necessary. Mali itself is perhaps the perfect example of that, because they were oppressed for 2,000 years by the Titans, yet as soon as the opportunity presented itself, they didn't hesitate to take 7 Titan shifters and use them for themselves. It's fair to say the Middle Eastern Alliance would likely be no different. All it takes is for someone to convince them that they can't beat Mali without assistance from the Titans of Paradis. More details about this potential team up will be shown in part 2, but for now let's move over to what would happen in the months after the volunteers arrive. To start with, Erwin would reveal the secret he's been hiding about how to activate the Founding Titan, and in this moment the possibility of a rumbling becomes known to everyone in the room. In my opinion, the commander would treat the rumbling as a backup option in case they were being bombarded or something, but no way would it be his number one choice, cause first of all, a full-scale rumbling was never anyone's first option, and even a partial use of the rumbling would only make Paradis a bigger target to those who survive. If Erwin's idea to join the Mideast War is going to happen, they need to avoid making new enemies by doing a rumbling, and instead focus on diplomacy starting with Asia and the Middle East. By establishing peace agreements with those other nations, it could be the start of a relationship that in the long term can turn Paradis into a modern country that doesn't need Titans to survive. In the year 842, Hizuru would then make their initial visit to the island, and at the time of their arrival, the Mideast War would still be raging on. This meeting would be important for a number of reasons, but above everything else, it's a chance for Erwin to persuade Kiyomi to abandon Zeke's proposal and follow his idea instead. As we all know, Zeke's plan required Erwin to activate a small-scale rumbling to scare off other nations for the next 50 years, and in that time, Hizuru would then help build Paradis into a modern country. The big downside was that Historia and her descendants would have to inherit the Beast Titan, so that they always had a Titan of royal blood and could therefore always do the rumbling. The problem is that this is something Erwin was desperate to avoid, and I think with Armin having died in this new timeline, he'd be even more determined to make sure the rest of his friends can live long lives. Because of this, Erwin would 100% be against Zeke's rumbling idea and would put his faith in the commander instead, who, his plan by contrast doesn't require a Titan of royal blood, but what it does need is cooperation from other countries, starting with the Asian clan. Hizru's resources would enable the scouts to infiltrate Mali, at which point they can split into teams and steal the Jaw, Armored Cart, and possibly the Beast Titan. Whether they take the Beast Titan will depend on certain factors that will be discussed in the next video, but the main point is that by launching a surprise attack on the warrior unit, Mali will be weakened to a point where they can potentially be destroyed. It should be said though that if Kiyomi was to assist the scouts in this alternate plan, it would be a massive betrayal of Zeke's trust, since if they're not going to do a rumbling, then there's no reason why Paradis would bring him to meet his brother. That being said, Zeke's troubles aren't really Kiyomi's problem, as the anime showed us she's capable of betraying people or lying to their face if it serves her best interests. Given that her country's been on the decline ever since the Great Titan War, I generally feel like she could be persuaded by Erwin to go along with his plan, as long as it still involves her getting access to the Iceberg Stone reserves. The Iceberg Stone is a special fuel source found only on Paradis, and according to Kiyomi it's so valuable that it could return her nation to its former glory, so she'd be desperate to reach a deal with the Eldians even if it's not the one she originally planned. In return for access to the Iceberg Stone, Hizru can provide the scouts with travel to Mali and the Middle East, as well as passing on the tools needed to build the island into a more civilized society. The way I see it, both sides have something the other wants, so for that reason Kiyomi and Erwin should be able to reach an agreement that doesn't involve the rumbling. And yeah, you'll see how that develops in part 2. Before I end this one, there were two things I didn't get the chance to talk about yet, the first being whether Bertolt's memories would be affecting the commander in any way. In the main timeline, we saw how Bertolt's influence made Armin fall in love with a crystal, but for the commander, I personally don't think that would happen. Unlike Armin, he had no pre-existing relationship with either Bertolt or Annie, and that was clearly a factor in why Armin was being haunted from the very beginning. Most of the time, the memories of a predecessor don't majorly affect the next person anyway. As you've seen with Ymir, Reiner, and even Bertolt himself, they were all unaffected by the previous person. I think Erwin would likely be in that same group, but let me know what you think in the comments down below. The second thing I didn't get to mention were the events surrounding this ceremony, as in the original series, Eren kissed Historia's hand, causing him to see memories from different points in time. This kiss would still happen in the alternate reality where Erwin survived, although the visions Eren sees now would not be exactly the same. I imagine he'd still pull the same face though, because there are a few ways in which this timeline is actually much worse than the original one, but we'll get to that in future parts. The best place to start this video off is in Mali, where the situation would be getting incredibly tense. Thanks to a completely anonymous source, the military higher-ups would have received credible evidence that spies from Paradis have infiltrated the country and are about to launch a revenge attack on Malian soil. Although the identity of these Eldian spies are unknown, it's entirely possible they have the power of multiple Titan shifters among them, including the founder or maybe even the Colossal. So if they were to strike, it could be the biggest disaster Mali's had in like the last 100 years. This is why the warrior unit and Commander Magath have been back home on the continent for nearly a month, having been temporarily recalled from their war against the Mid-East Alliance. A decision to take them away from the war and recall them back to Mali wouldn't be as controversial as you might expect, considering most of the Mid-East war was fought on the sea with no place for Titans to intervene anyway. But still, it would give the Middle Eastern forces a temporary advantage. In the few weeks since Reiner and the gang have been back on the mainland, Paradis surprisingly haven't launched any attacks, and crucially, no movement from Eldian spies has been detected by Malian intelligence. This inactivity would cause the general to rethink his strategy, and at Warrior HQ, he'd order the Beast and Jaw Titan to be redeployed to the Middle East in a few days, while Reiner and Peak will be staying behind in Mali as a precaution. Sometime after the meeting is done, Zeke would innocently invite his fellow warriors and their families for dinner the following evening, so they can all have a meal together prior to him and Porker going back to the war. Of course, the others would agree to come since they have no reason to say no, and once they finish talking, Zeke would stroll into his office as the others head towards the internment zone. In his office, the captain would lock the door as he quickly writes down certain times and locations on a piece of paper and then places it inside his pocket alongside something else. He'd then make his way out of HQ as discreetly as humanly possible, making sure not to draw any attention as he walks in the direction of a nearby alleyway. In this alleyway would be a mystery man who'd been waiting for the last few hours, and after seeing Zeke, he'd start asking questions about the internment zone and a few other things, to which the Beast Titan would simply pass on the letter he wrote. Zeke would also take 2 vials out of his pocket that each contain a transparent liquid, before handing them over to the man and then immediately making his way back to the Gate of Liberio. Flashing forward around 24 hours, Magath would be in the middle of giving a briefing in preparation for the Beast and Jaw Titan going away. He'd explain that more troops will be brought down from the mountains to patrol the streets of Mali, while random blood tests will continue to be carried out to discover any Eldian spies hiding in the general population. As the meeting goes on, Reiner would start doubting whether he has what it takes to protect his homeland in Zeke and Porco's absence, especially given that he still suffers from nightmares and PTSD to this day. That being said, towards the end of the briefing, he'd get some slight reassurance from Magath, who'd claimed that a weapon arrived at HQ last night that's capable of taking down a Titan. At this time, the commander wouldn't be allowed to go into further details about what this weapon is, but he'd mention it to reassure Pieck and Reiner that they'll have backup in case things take a bad turn. Zeke would naturally be the one to press Magath on the details of what this new weapon is, but the commander wouldn't give anything away, as only the very highest ranked officers would be aware of its presence in the city. Later that evening, everyone would arrive at the warrior captain's house for dinner, with Reiner bringing his mother, Pieck bringing her dad, and Porco bringing both of his parents. Interestingly, Zeke's own grandparents would be absent from the meal, but he'd probably claim that they were feeling unwell, which I guess is a believable excuse considering their age and mental states. Hours later, all the guests would be having a good time, with the food and wine being almost completely finished, but throughout the night, the beast would make sure never to lose track of the time. Around 10 o'clock, he'd politely ask his guests to leave, and as the Galliard and Bourne families make their way home, Zeke would pull Pieck to the side for a quick chat. Moving over to Reiner's house, he and Karina would arrive home within 10 minutes or so, and the vice captain would head upstairs to his childhood bedroom. Entering the room, he'd instantly notice a breeze coming through the open window, and as he closes it, someone would suddenly shut the door behind him. Reiner would turn around to see none other than Eren frickin' Jaeger in the corner of his room, fully kitted out in the upgraded ODM gear, and I imagine his shock would be even worse than it was in the main series. It's not that he'd be surprised that Eren is in Mali, because the evidence already implied that might have been the case, but instead, Reiner's fear would come from the fact that he's being confronted in the one place he's most vulnerable. With his mother being downstairs, the Armor Titan can't even think about transforming without risking killing her in the process, but by contrast, Eren has nothing to lose, and could be ready to blow up the whole neighborhood at any given time. Switching back to Zeke and Pieck, these two would be walking along the streets of the internment zone, having dropped her father back home. Zeke's ultimate goal at this point would be to lure her into this building, and I'm sure he'd tell her any lie to make that happen. You guys maybe let me know in the comments what you think he would say to try and convince her to follow him, but regardless of what he says, I think she'd still be suspicious at the fact that, he only wants to bring her and not Reiner and Porco as well. On top of that, Zeke knows firsthand that Pieck is a smart girl who could realize if she's being taken to a trap, which is why I think he'd have a backup plan already in place. The wine that Pieck's dad was drinking from all evening contains the warrior captain's spinal fluid, so if Pieck tries to resist him in any way, he can always rely on that backup and threaten to turn her dad into a pure Titan. Anyway, once they make it to this building, Zeke would be the one to personally cut the rope, trapping Pieck in this underground container that was specifically designed to restrain Titan shifters. Seconds later, a handful of scouts would enter the room, including Nile and Hanji, and their priority is securing the cart Titan in case any Malian soldiers enter the internment zone. Dozens more scouts would be on the surrounding rooftops ready to provide support, while Commander Erwin would also be outside for a very different reason. As Zeke exits the building, Erwin would maneuver down from the rooftops and onto the street, coming face to face with the man who essentially killed him 4 years earlier. At the Braun household, Eren would have forced Reiner to take a seat by now, as the two of them have a massively awkward conversation. Eren would start aggressively asking loaded questions about why his mother had to die, and if Karina's life is somehow more valuable than Carla's. Meanwhile, Reiner would just be sitting there trying not to say anything to piss him off. It should be mentioned that this version of Eren has had different experiences to the one in the main show, with a big deviation being that he never went rogue in Mali. It was that experience living on the continent that changed his perspective in the final season, as he realized that Eldians in Liberia were just people, no different to the people on Paradise. In this new timeline, however, Eren never had that realization, and as a result, his demeanor would be angrier because he'd be more motivated by the vengeful spark inside him that wants to make Reiner suffer as much as possible. From downstairs, Karina would hear some of the noise and call out to her son to ask if he's okay, but Eren would signal for him not to reply. This would cause Reiner to break down under the guilt, because he'd understand that it was his decision to carry on with the mission that day that has indirectly led to his friends being dead and now his hometown being in danger. He'd likely collapse to the ground and beg Eren to kill him as long as Liberia was left unharmed, while simultaneously as this is going on, Karina would start making her way up the stairs. Across the street, Flock, Mikasa and the rest of Levi's squad would be observing the situation from the rooftops, waiting for Eren to come back outside. The original plan was for him to hide inside the property, catch Reiner by surprise and then chop off his limbs, and Eren was sent in by himself because as a Titan shifter he's the only one who could survive if the Armored Titan decided to transform. While that possibility was always unlikely with his mother being in the house, Erwin still wouldn't want to take any chances with this because the scouts have been burned by Reiner one too many times in the past. As the squad try and get a look through Reiner's bedroom window, they notice Karina opening the bedroom door, and with barely any time to process that information, the house would explode in front of their eyes, with the attack titan emerging from the flames. An incomplete armor titan would be lying face down in the rubble, and Levi would think to himself that he should have known Eren might do something like this. On the ground, the armored would be lacking in energy due to his less than enthusiastic will to live, but he desperately tried to pick himself up to search for Karina. Before that can happen though, the attack titan would just start absolutely beating the shit out of him as the innocent civilians start running out of their homes and away from the battle. I imagine during this one-sided fight, Eren would do something totally unnecessary, like maybe throwing Reiner into an apartment building or doing something like that, cause to him, this beatdown is payback for everything the warriors did to Paradis. Mikasa and Jean would likely be apprehensive about the excessive loss of innocent life that Eren is causing, as Captain Levi would be checking his stopwatch to make sure they have time for this. Now, in case any of you are wondering about Porco, he'd probably just be at home relaxing, totally unaware of what his comrades are going through. Unlike what happened to Reiner, there wouldn't have been any scouts waiting for him inside his own house, but there would be around 20 soldiers monitoring him from the rooftops. I think he'd first start to realize something's wrong when waves of civilians start running past his house, and when Galliard eventually goes to check outside, he'd see an apartment building collapse once Reiner gets thrown into it. After seeing that, he'd 100% get triggered like he always does, and run in the direction of the action. The 20 scouts on the roof would start trailing behind him as he gets closer and closer to Eren, and they start firing at Porco once he makes it into some open space away from the civilians. In his human form, Galliard would manage to dodge a few of these bullets, but at some point he would get shot in a non-fatal area. At the same time, Eren would continue beating the stuffing out of the armored titan, and in desperation, Reiner would scream so loudly that it could be heard from outside the internment zone. 4 years earlier in Shiganshina, he used a similar tactic to get the attention of his fellow warriors, but this time around, I think he'd also be hoping to get the attention of Commander Magath and his alleged titan-killing weapon. The armored by himself simply doesn't have enough strength to fight Eren and the whole of Levi's squad by himself, so without backup, he will die without knowing whether his mother is alive under the rubble. A moment after his scream, the Jaw Titan would appear in his neighborhood at high speed, having used his injury from being shot as the catalyst for his transformation. In this Titan form, he'd managed to quickly kill a couple of the scouts that were trailing him, but the remaining 18 of them would still be just behind. The members of Levi's squad would obviously see Porco trying to charge at Eren, and Mikasa would be the one to fire off her Thunder Spear to send him flying backwards. Meanwhile, after getting some instructions from Levi, Eren would stop messing around with Reiner, and he'd back away as Jean, Connie and Sasha launch a coordinated Thunder Spear attack. This attack would completely blow Reiner out of his shell, while at the same time the Jaw Titan would continue to be ripped apart by the dozens of scouts surrounding him. Rewinding the clock a bit, outside the internment zone, Commander Magath would have been woken up by the sounds of hundreds of panicking Eldians. At HQ, he'd attempt to call the homes of each warrior with no response, while the general would start organizing troops to surround Liberio. From their office, they each would have heard the armored titan scream, which I mentioned earlier, and this would confirm to Magath that one of his shifters has to be in serious trouble. We've seen in the anime how he doesn't like the warriors being put in risky situations where they could lose their power, so even though he doesn't know what's happened to Reiner, he'd realize that he needs to send in some support just in case. Not that long afterwards, hundreds of Malian troops would be making their way to the walls under the general's orders, but these preparations would be interrupted by a strange object flying out of the internment zone. A single wooden barrel would race over their heads as it flies further into the city, and as it begins to come down, a quick flash of lightning would appear, followed by a powerful explosion. The blast itself would instantly flatten a lot of Malian infrastructure, including the train station, buildings, roads, parts of the wall, and like 90% of Warrior HQ. Towards the center of the internment zone, even the scouts would be feeling some intense blowback, but Erwin intentionally wouldn't have done a maximum blast so he could minimize that risk. Thanks to information they acquired from Zeke, the main purpose of this transformation would be to wipe out the high-ranking Malian officers at HQ, thereby destabilizing the chain of command. As we know, most other high-ranking officers would be in the Middle East right now dealing with that war, so the blow from Erwin means that the troops in Liberio no longer have any leaders to coordinate them. That by itself gives Paradis and Hizuru a perfect window to launch the next stage of their invasion, but first they need to take the remaining shifters out of Malian hands. Switching back into the internment zone, Eren would pick up the Jaw Titan's decimated body and prepare to bite the nape, but he'd pause when the Beast Titan appears from around the corner. As Zeke walks in their direction, Galliard would be the most excited person to see him, but he'd realize pretty quickly that something was wrong. Contrary to what Porco would expect, the Beast Titan wouldn't try to save him or even attack the Survey Corps. In fact, I imagine he'd just be casually strolling through the street. Eventually, Zeke would crouch down to examine Reiner's tied up, unconscious body, and as he picks it up, nearly all the scouts would make their way onto the rooftops to watch. The only remaining soldier on ground level would be Flock, and everyone else would be observing from above as he walks closer to the Beast Titan. Zeke would likely ask him if he's sure about what's about to happen, and the scout would have to give him some kind of signal to let him know that he's okay. Without hesitation, the Beast Titan would then scream at the top of his lungs, causing a flashing light to appear where Flock was standing, not to mention a few other lights would simultaneously appear across the zone. As a side note, the whole time this is going on, Erwin would still be holding the Jaw Titan in his hands, basically forcing Galliard to watch this top 10 anime betrayal. When the smoke finally disappears, Flock's Pure Titan would be revealed, and thanks to the way it was created, Zeke's royal blood gives him full control over its actions. The first thing the beast would do would be to order Flock to eat the Armored Titan, because like I said, Reiner's unconscious body would be in the palm of Zeke's hand. The Flock Pure Titan would instantly run towards it as Galliard watches in disbelief, but as is usually the case with Reiner, I figured he'd get some kind of plot armor that would save him just in time. As the Flock Titan is about to, reach him and eat him alive, it would get absolutely skewered by a pillar of hardening that randomly spirals out the ground. Behind Zeke, we'd see a fully formed Lara Tiber Warhammer Titan approaching, and in case you didn't guess, the Warhammer would be the Titan-killing weapon that Magath was referring to earlier, because at this stage in the timeline, the only weapon that Marley has that can destroy Titan shifters is shifters of their own. Given everything that's happened, it'd be pretty obvious to her that Zeke has betrayed Marley, and before anyone can react, she sends spikes directly through the Beast Titan. This would be followed up by doing the same thing to Erwin as well, meaning that within just a few seconds, Lara Tiber would have used her hardening against 3 separate enemies. In response to this, Zeke would call out for his Pure Titans to defend him, and across the city they'd each start running towards his direction. At the same time, Mikasa would spring into action from the rooftops and fire a solid amount of Thunder Spears at the Warhammer Titan's neck. This massive explosion would send it crashing into the ground as if it was dead, giving the Aegaros an opening to free themselves from the spikes of hardening. I imagine Zeke would then take a minute to free Flock's Pure Titan, which was suspended in the air from the previous video, while Captain Levi would swoop down to retrieve the helpless Reiner. Outside the internment zone, Commander Erwin would still be walking around in his Colossal Titan, but he'd begin to emerge as a whole fleet of airships descend from the clouds. These airships would all belong to Hizru's army, and their arrival would be part of the wider plan to defeat Marley. Within the next 12 hours, the combined forces of Asia and Paradis are planning to force the Marlians to surrender by launching coordinated attacks on their key military bases. This includes destroying the airship base in Fort Salta as well as other significant locations, and the scouts will need to split into teams for this to happen. With Erwin having seemingly destroyed Marley's chain of command in the last video, the next 12 hours is super important as it's best to strike now before Marley has any chance to reorganize itself. As the airships get closer, Erwin would then fully exit the Colossal and hitch a ride to the center of the zone where the Warhammer Titan is fighting for its life. At this point, all of Zeke's Pure Titans are now in the area, forcing Lara to defend herself from Peek's dad, Porco's mother, and Flock, not to mention constant Thunder Spear attacks from Mikasa. In a situation like this, the Warhammer would have to keep using more and more hardening to stay in the fight, which by default drains more and more energy. Now, off to the side, Porco would have manifested a new Jaw Titan so he can try and take down Eren, but Zeke would make a move to defend his younger brother. In particular, he'd command his last remaining Pure Titan to attack, and if you do the math, you'll realize that this Titan here is actually Porco's own father. Earlier that night, Mr. and Mrs. Galliard was spiked at dinner with Zeke's spinal fluid, alongside Reiner's mother and Peek's dad. But with Karina being squashed in the last video, only 3 of the parents became Titans when Zeke eventually screamed. The beast would try to psych Porco out by telling him this, and it wouldn't take long for the warrior to realize that this isn't a bluff, since the Titan attacking him would look exactly like his own dad. He'd then look over to see his mother fighting against the Warhammer, and this is the moment when his soul would break in two. Galliard would consider for a second whether he should just let one of his parents eat him, but while he's distracted, Levi would pounce in to chop off the Jaw Titan's legs, with Eren following this up by ripping off his arms and smashing his face into the ground. Meanwhile, the Warhammer Titan would also be getting seriously overwhelmed, and in this moment she'd have to use her last drop of energy, which is precisely what Zeke had been waiting for. His strategy from the beginning was to wear her down using his minions, and having now witnessed her final desperate attack, he'd launch a pitching assault to finish her off. The beast would then tell his Pure Titans to stop fighting as he goes to examine the Warhammer's body, and after finding the trail and following it, he'd eventually find Lara's Titan Crystal. While that's happening, Commander Erwin would arrive on the rooftops to observe the situation, and he'd watch on as Zeke tosses the Warhammer Crystal to Eren. The reason he passes it to his brother is pretty simple, but in order to explain, it's best to do a brief flashback. 2 years ago, when Paradis and Hizuru would have begun planning this invasion, Zeke would have helped out by sending intel about the strengths and weaknesses of each warrior. Because of this intel, the scouts have known for a while that the Jaw Titan can break anything, and with Galliard being defeated, Eren instinctively shoves the crystal inside his mouth. He then lifts Porco into the air and uses him like a nutcracker, which grinds Lara's body down to nothingness, and as Eren drinks her spinal fluid, he'd gain the powers of the Warhammer Titan. Following this, Eren starts to go off script as he begins to eat Porco as well, but the commander would shout from the sidelines telling him to stop. Months ago, it was already decided who would inherit the Jaw Titan if everything went to plan, and the person selected was Louise. To be more specific, she would have definitely volunteered herself, as she's always had that mentality that you can't do anything without power. Louise would likely think that by inheriting one of the 9 Titans, she could elevate herself to a similar level of strength and importance to Mikasa, and ultimately that would be her core motivation. As a consequence of this selection, everyone would keep shouting until Eren finally gives up, and the commander would then maneuver down to retrieve Porco's body himself. In the process, all 3 of the warriors have now been captured by the Survey Corps, and the plan is for the Jaw and Armor Titans to be eaten here in Liberio. When it comes to the Cart Titan, everyone will want to keep her alive for insurance purposes, because if someone gets injured on the battlefield, then her Titan can be used to bring them back to life. Anyway, Eren would then exit his Attack Titan, and I imagine that him and the other scouts would have final things they'd want to say to Reiner before he dies. Once that's all said and done, Zeke would give Floch's Pure Titan the order to eat him, and sadly for him, there wouldn't be enough plot armor to save the warrior this time around. Everyone would be watching on as Floch chews Reiner like a piece of gum, and as a quick side note, I reckon that Erwin's first choice to get the Armor Titan wouldn't have been Floch, but actually I think it would have been Jean. His leadership qualities would have made him one of the ideal candidates to inherit a shifter, but after speaking with Hanji about it, they realized that making this choice would probably damage their relations with Eren. Soon after, Floch would have completely finished eating Reiner, and Louise would now be preparing for her own transformation. Just like Floch, she'd drink a vial of Zeke's spinal fluid, and the advantage of doing it this way is that her Titan can be controlled. This means if something goes wrong, they can always improvise, as a Titan that can follow instructions is a lot more useful than one that just does what it wants. Sometime after Louise drinks the fluid, she maneuvered down to the ground, and gives Zeke a signal to let him know that she's ready. The beast would then scream at the top of his lungs for the second time today, and once she's a pure Titan, he'd waste no time in ordering her to eat Porco. As she goes to take a bite out of the warrior, a large explosion suddenly happens out of nowhere in a nearby part of the internment zone. The building that exploded was the one where the Cart Titan was being held, and from where Erwin's standing he can clearly see the flames taking over. In response, he'd instantly send Levi and a few others to take a good look, while everyone else stays where they are to make sure nothing happens to Louise. Meanwhile, on the streets of Liberio, Commander Magath would be on the run with Peak, as the two of them are trying to find out what's going on. Having both recently escaped near-death situations, the only intel they know for sure right now is that Zeke has switched sides. Magath would therefore want to find answers by running in the direction of the Beast Titan's last scream, and a few minutes later they arrive in Reiner's old neighborhood. From a distance, the two of them would observe as Louise emerges from her pure Titan, and seeing this would make it fairly obvious that Marley just lost one of their shifters. I think Magath's first thought would be that Louise must have eaten the Warhammer, because across the battlefield there'd be a bunch of hardening left behind by Lara Tiber. As Peak scans the area for any sign of Reiner and Porco, she noticed that standing next to Zeke are 3 familiar looking pure Titans. Their calm behavior would indicate that they've been created by the Beast Titan, and by looking at their faces I'm pretty sure she'd wonder whether she knows these people. Peak being Peak, I'm sure it wouldn't take that long for her brain to start putting the pieces together, and she'd soon remember the wine that Zeke gave them to drink. At the same time, up on the rooftops, Commander Erwin would now be eager to move on to the next phase of the invasion. His aim is for the scouts to split into their respective teams and get on the airships, because if they stay in Liberia much longer then it'll only end up risking lives for no reason. Because he wants to wrap things up, he'd ask Sasha, Connie and Jean to kill the 3 remaining pure Titans in the area, while Peak watches on in complete shock. By now, she's fully realized what Zeke must have done to her dad, and Magath would have to hold her back as she's desperately trying to run to him. Remember, the whole reason she became a warrior in the first place was so that Mr. Finger could get medical treatment, and in doing that, she's proven that she's willing to sacrifice her own life in order for him to live. In that sense, it would be very in character for her to try and get herself eaten by him so that he can turn back into a human, but there's no way Magath would want that to happen. For a start, he'd remind Peak that her dad likely wouldn't want to survive if it meant he had to eat his only child in the process. The guilt would be way too much for any parent to handle, and Mr. Finger would also become a target for the scouts if he inherits the Cart Titan. For those reasons, Peak would stop to think about whether sacrificing herself is the right thing to do, But before she can decide, Jean swoops in and kills her dad instantly. Seeing this from a distance would understandably make Peak hysterical, and she'd likely just want to rush in there and get revenge, because her dad was her only family. That being said, Magath would try his best to convince her not to, and the two of them would get into a heated debate about what they need to do next. Now, in case you're wondering about Captain Levi, he would have arrived outside the burning building alongside the other scouts who were sent along. Their main priority here would be finding any survivors, with Hanji and Nal being two of the people who were supposed to be inside. At first, Levi would call out to Hanji from the street, but after not hearing any reply, the captain would 100% make the decision to go in. The flames inside would be so intense that I don't think even he'd be able to survive for long, but what he'd do is quickly sprint through the building trying to find any signs of life. As he enters the room where the cart titan was being held, he noticed body parts all over the floor, and off to the side he'd see Hanji's broken goggles. Based off all the damage in the room, Levi assumes that something happened here that triggered a thunder spear explosion, although right now he doesn't have time to investigate as the flames continue to get more and more intense. The captain would pick up the goggles from the floor as he makes his way out of there, and on his face there'd just be a glum expression as he exits the building. As the other scouts approach him, he let them know there were no survivors, and in his mind, the cart titan has to be the one responsible. One way or another, Peak managed to escape while everyone else in the room was blown to pieces, so clearly something must have happened, and Levi would tell his subordinates to search the area for clues on where she might have gone. Switching back to Reiner's neighborhood, by this point the survey corps would begin separating into their different teams, and Erin's team arguably has the most significant job. Their mission would be to completely destroy Fort Salta, which is an airship base located in the south of the continent. The weapons found in that base are some of the most dangerous that the Malians have to offer, so if it was flattened to the ground, then Mali surrendering becomes a lot more possible. However, because Fort Salta is so far away from Liberio, Erin's team would actually need to travel there by flying boat, which is a faster type of plane created by Hizrun. By contrast, Commander Erwin's team is meant to be traveling to the north of Mali by airship, where they plan to attack two important naval bases. Given that Zeke is part of Erwin's group, he finally exits his Beast Titan after all this time, and a random scout swoops in to take him onto the aircraft. Everyone else then starts to maneuver onto their respective ships, except for the commander as he'd still be waiting for Levi to come back. Having waited long enough, he decides it's time to head off in the direction of the burning building himself, while the remaining scouts continue to grab rides out of the internment zone. 3 of those remaining scouts would be Sasha, Connie and Jean, who would be on the rooftops trying to remember which ship they need to be on. In particular, Connie and Sasha would be slightly confused, but Jean would remind them that they need to be on the same ship as the Beast Titan. As the 3 of them have a brief conversation before they leave, a quick flash of lightning would appear behind them, followed by the cart titan rushing in to swallow Jean. The shifter would then rapidly jump from rooftop to rooftop with him inside its mouth, and Peak would be long gone by the time that Sasha and Connie even react. Several minutes later, the cart would arrive in a secluded area of the internment zone, where Commander Magath would already be waiting. After congratulating Peak for getting the job done, she'd release Jean from her mouth, and the general would take him into one of the empty houses nearby. This house is where the interrogation would begin, and they start asking him questions about Zeke's relationship with the scouts, as well as what Paradis are planning to do next. On top of that, they'd also want to know Reiner and Porco's location, but Jean would stay quiet the whole time until Magath aims his gun. We've always known that Jean is someone who doesn't want to die a pointless death, so he wouldn't want to get his head blown off in this abandoned house. With a gun being pointed directly at him, his new plan is to stall until Connie and Sasha arrive, because he'd have faith that they would be able to find him. As a consequence, Jean would begin responding to Peak and the commander's questions, but he tried to confuse them by giving them a ton of vague answers that don't really go anywhere. Eventually, this would frustrate Magath to the point where he starts personally breaking the scouts' bones, at which point Jean would tell them that there's no way Mali can win, now that Paradis has the founding titan. This of course would be referring to the fact that they now have the founder and a titan of royal blood, but at this stage in the timeline, Peak and Magath didn't know that a titan of royal blood was required. From their point of view, Paradis already had the founding titan, so Jean's statement would be something that would definitely get their attention. While they interrogate him further to understand what he meant, Connie and Sasha would be on the streets of Liberio trying to find him. Being an experienced hunter, I think Sasha would be especially good at tracking Peak's titan footprints, and before long they'd arrive near the secluded area. As they continue their search, they suddenly hear the sound of a gunshot from one of the nearby buildings, and as they head towards it, Magath and the cart titan would make their escape from the area. Upon finally reaching the house that Jean was being kept in, they'd find him lying on the floor losing a ton of blood, and the nature of the injury meant there'd be nothing they could do to save him. The only way he'd be able to survive is if they turned him into a pure titan here and now, but neither of them would have any of Zeke's spinal fluid or any of the titan transformation serum. Instead, they keep shouting at Jean to keep his eyes open while they head back to the ship, but with his final breath, I think he told them both to live comfortable lives when this is all over, which is something that he'll never get to do. Back at the burning building, Levi and Erwin would be reunited as the captain hands over Hanji's broken goggles. He told the commander his theory that Null and Hanji were killed by the Cart Titan, and the loss of two close friends would definitely be a shock even for someone like him. However, with the scouts about to potentially face the final stage in the war against Mali, Erwin would understand better than anyone that this isn't the right time to just stand around and grieve. Instead, I'm sure he'd thank Levi for salvaging Hanji's goggles, and he'd proceed to give a motivating speech to the remaining scouts in the area. Following that, everyone would make their way onto the airships, and on the ground, Peak and Magath would watch on as the ships all head in different directions. Over the next 12 hours, an all-out war would break out across the Malian continent, with Eren's team devastating Fort Salta. Using their Titans, he and Flock would destroy every single airship at the base, while Louise would go on a wild rampage, killing tons of enemy soldiers. Given that this is her first time becoming a shifter, I think it's natural that she'd eventually start to lose control, hence why Mikasa would be here to deal with Louise and Flock in case things get out of hand. On the ground, Eren's team would also be supported by soldiers from Hizuru, who would parachute into the base after arriving in separate flying boats. Simultaneously, on the opposite side of the continent, Erwin and Zeke would be travelling to their targets by airship. As always, Zeke's hidden motivation is to complete the euthanization plan, but on the surface, he's been helping Paradis to plan this invasion for the past 2 years. During that time, he gave them valuable intel to gain the commander's trust, and once the war is over, he believes that he'll finally be accepted onto the island and allowed to speak to Eren. Erwin, on the other hand, would see things a lot differently, and I'll try to explain his thought process. Considering that the Beast Titan massacred the scouts, Erwin would have zero faith that he actually wants to help them, meaning that Zeke must have a hidden motivation. While the commander wouldn't know for sure what that hidden motivation is, it doesn't take a genius to realize that it's something to do with the founding Titan. Because of this, Erwin would understand that Paradis has what Zeke wants, and as Yelena revealed, the warriors wouldn't be returning to the island anytime soon. What this meant is that Zeke's last remaining hope to come to the island and meet his brother is dependent on the scouts, and so Erwin used that to their advantage. For the past 2 years, the commander forced the Beast Titan to prove his loyalty by sending them valuable intel, and this was all in the promise that he'd get to talk with his brother in the end. Zeke had to accept this proposal because he quite literally had no other option to get to Paradis, and after everything he's done, he assumes that Erwin now trusts him. In reality, he'd already made plans for Zeke to be detained underground as soon as they arrive on the island, and if everything goes to plan, he'll never meet Eren again. In that way, both of these men have hidden motivations that they're hiding from each other, but on the surface they're pretending to be comrades. 19 hours after the attack in Liberio, the Malian military would have suffered their worst day in recent history, forcing Willy Tybur to think about their options. With Fort Salta being destroyed, Mali no longer has any weapons that can kill Titan shifters, meaning they're pretty much helpless if these attacks continue. As Willy considers what they should do next, Commander Magath and Peak would arrive to discuss what's going on. Based on the information they were able to get from Jean, they now know that Zeke is a Titan of royal blood, and that together, the Jaeger Bros can activate the full potential of the founding Titan. From Mali's point of view, this means the enemy can nuke them with the rumbling at any given time, making this whole situation even worse than it already was. The smart thing to do would be for them to surrender before they get trampled, but there's a couple of reasons why they'd hesitate. Reason number one is that Commander Magath would be thinking of Peak, because if Mali surrenders, then it's likely she'll have to go on the run to avoid being captured and eaten. Reason number two is that if they give up, then it probably means the return of the Eldian Empire, which is something that the entire planet has been afraid of for the last 100 years. Despite that, Peak would suggest a crazy idea that involves allowing both of those things to happen, because in the scenario that they find themselves in, it might be the only way to strike back at the enemy. After hearing the plan, Willy would have to think hard about it for a while, because if they do what she's proposing, then it means the end of Mali, at least in its current form. The upside, however, is that if this works, they'll be able to get revenge for the family they lost in Liberio, and the three of them will be known as heroes who saved the world, just like Helos. For those reasons, Willy would agree to set Peak's plan in motion, and several hours later the alliance between Hizuru and Paradis would receive a communication. This communication would be an official notice of surrender from the Malian government, on the one condition that Paradis stops with their ongoing attacks. Of course, a surrender is what Erwin had been hoping for the entire time, and after 2 years of preparation, the scouts would have managed to defeat the biggest military force on the planet. The fallout from this victory would have huge ramifications in all corners of the globe, but first, let's do a quick recap of what would happen on the island over the next few weeks and months. To start things off, all surviving scouts would come back home to a hero's welcome, but for members of the 104th Cadets, the celebrations would be overshadowed by something else. Eren and Mikasa in particular would only find out about Jean's death once they arrive, and to say they'd be devastated is putting it lightly. Not only was Jean a close friend that had a huge impact on their lives, but after losing Armin a few years ago, this death would make Eren feel like a broken man. During the following days, there'd be funerals for all of the fallen soldiers, and on top of that, there'd also be big political changes too. Firstly, Erwin would have now led the scouts to impossible victories in Shiganshina and in Mali itself, and so his level of popularity across the island would easily reach legendary status. Having sensed the overwhelming public opinion, Zachary would announce his intention to retire at the end of the year, with Erwin being chosen as his successor. As Commander-in-Chief, Zachary is head of all 3 military branches, and so at the end of the year, that responsibility would be passed down to the Colossal Titan. The knock-on effect here is that the scouts would also need someone to replace Erwin before the year is up, but with Hanji and Jean both dying in the war, 2 of the best potential candidates aren't even a possibility. In terms of ranking, Levi would be the next logical person to be commander, but he almost certainly wouldn't be interested, so the door would be left open for other people to make their case for it. In terms of other big changes for the island, the next inheritor of the female Titan would be another big issue. For the past 4 years, Annie has been chilling inside her crystal, but as shown in Liberia with Lara Tiber, the scouts have a solid blueprint for breaking her out of there. Using Louise's power, they can crush Annie and feed her spinal fluid to a pure Titan, but the question is, who would be worthy of eating her? This is where the politics creeps in, as the crystal has been in military police custody ever since she was first captured. Given that the MPs have been looking after Annie this whole time, the higher-ups would feel like one of their people should be the next female Titan. Doing this would drastically improve their declining image, with the average citizen perceiving the MPs as useless and corrupt, despite them technically being the most prestigious military branch. As a consequence, they'd pull some strings to have one of their soldiers selected, and the specific person they'd want to inherit the female would be Hitch. It's not that Hitch would be the best candidate for the job, but rather her story is what would improve the image of the military police. As Annie's former roommate who was betrayed and the main person who looked after the crystal, they could easily spin this into a narrative that would gain the respect of ordinary people. Of course, Hitch herself would be reluctant to shorten her lifespan just so that MPs can look good, but the higher-ups would try to bribe her with huge financial incentives. At first, I think she would consider accepting this. However, this shady scenario would remind her of Marlowe and his crazy ambition to clean up the MPs. Seeing a real chance to try and make that dream a reality, she would agree to inherit the female Titan, but only under certain conditions. The condition she proposed would be the first big step towards wiping out corruption in the military police, and the leadership on the island would personally agree to make sure it happens. As a result, 7 months after the victory against Mali, a ceremony would be held in which Annie's crystal is crushed by Louise and fed to Hitch's pure Titan. In the process, she'd become the 5th member of the Titan Shifter unit, alongside Flock, Louise, Eren, and of course Commander Erwin. Now, in case you're wondering about Zeke, he'd currently be locked up as a prisoner in this special mountain facility. This secret facility would be far away from civilization, and the beast would have been brought here only a few hours after the war was over. It's important to remember that Levi was on the same airship as these two, and so as soon as they touched down on the island, the captain would have instantly chopped off Zeke's limbs and his tongue to stop him from transforming. From there, the beast was taken to this special prison, which was specifically made so they could restrain him away from the rest of society. Unfortunately for Zeke, being betrayed by Erwin has meant that he's not had any chances to speak with Eren about the euthanization plan, and with his time as the Beast Titan running out, it's not looking good. Anyway, switching over to the continent, there'd be some big changes there as well, with the Malian government now being under Hizuru's control. From the beginning, the main goal of the Azumabito was to restore their nation to its former status, and that's now become possible thanks to all the weapons, the land, and the resources they've gained from this invasion. That being said, around the world there'd be a very mixed reaction to the news of Hizuru taking over, and I'll explain the reasoning behind this. To start things off, the reason Mali was so hated was because they used Titans to invade a ton of countries, and so in that sense a lot of people would be happy that they lost. However, as a result of Mali losing, the Island Devils now have 8 of the 9 Titans, including the founder, making them way more dangerous than the warriors used to be. This level of strength would cause many nations to be afraid of what Eldia is planning next, and in particular they'd fear that what just happened to Mali could also happen to them. The combination of Eldia's Titans and Hizuru's weapons is a force that can destroy any country on the planet, and so these countries would be feeling pretty tense about the situation. To help ease these tensions, the Azumabito would grant independence to several nations colonized by Mali, including Onyankopon's home country, and this would be an attempt to prove that they can be trusted. On a similar note, Eldia would sign a declaration promising never to use pure Titans, but there's a reason why these promises wouldn't be enough to stop the growing hatred against them. Ever since the war ended, Willie Tybur would have been using his influence behind the scenes to manipulate public opinion. It's been established that the Tyburs have strong connections to very important people, and 7 months ago, Peak's theory was that these connections could be used to form an alliance against Eldia. Because Willie believed in this plan, he fled the continent after Mali surrendered, and since then he's been going from country to country warning politicians about the dangers of the rumbling. He'd explained to leaders of every nation the significance of Eldia now having the founding Titan and a Titan of royal blood, and people would take him seriously because of how well respected the Tybur family is. As a consequence, it wouldn't take long for anti-Eldia and anti-Hizru propaganda to start appearing in newspapers, as this would be used to generate more fear towards the island. The story that would be told to the world is that the Jaeger brothers are planning to revive the old Eldian Empire, and that Hizru were helping them by giving the island weapons and technology. Eventually, all this panic would lead to the formation of a secret military alliance just like Peak predicted, and in the present day, her plan to get revenge would be in the final stages. Back on the island, the military higher-ups would be holding talks about what they should do next, as things wouldn't have played out the way they expected. Although their invasion of Mali was successful, Eldia itself is now perceived as the new biggest threat, making them a target for the entire world. With Zeke's time running out, they also have fewer options to defend themselves, because when he dies, they'll no longer be able to do the rumbling. Of course, if Historia was to eat Zeke, then they could hold on to that rumbling power for 13 more years, but making her do this comes with certain downsides. From the beginning, Eren has been aggressively against the idea of Historia becoming a Titan, and during these talks he'd tell the commander they need to find another way. If they let her become the Beast Titan, then it would mean all their sacrifices in Liberia were for nothing, since Eldia would still be relying on the rumbling for their survival. The whole point of their invasion against Mali was to secure a future where the rumbling wouldn't be necessary, and so Eren would feel that in memory of everyone that died, they can't allow Historia to be Titanized. To an extent, everyone would understand where Eren is coming from with this, and a couple days later he'd invite the Queen and all members of the Titan Shifter unit for a meeting. The purpose of this meeting would be for him to reveal a certain proposal he's come up with, and this proposal is guaranteed to protect the island while potentially saving Historia's life at the same time. For a bit of context, at this stage in the timeline, the government wouldn't be interested in getting into a war with the rest of the planet, and right now, both Eldia and Hizru would be trying to engage in peace negotiations with the enemy nations that want to kill them. For that reason, it's too soon to know for sure whether the island will need the rumbling for its future survival, and a consequence of that is that it's also too soon to know for sure whether Historia needs to inherit the Beast Titan. The problem here is that in a few months' time, Zeke is going to die due to the curse of Ymir, so someone has to eat him before that happens, otherwise Eldia will lose the power of his shifter. As a result, everyone will make the decision that one of the current scouts will be chosen to inherit this shifter, and whoever that person might be, when they eat Zeke, the island will no longer have a Titan of royal blood. Having no Titan of royal blood means that Eldia will lose its potential to do the rumbling in a few months, but Erwin's secret plan will allow them to reverse that decision if they need to. To put it simply, for the rest of their lives, Flock, Hitch and Louise will take turns acting as Historia's personal bodyguard, and at all times they'll need to have a syringe of spinal fluid. If there's ever an emergency that requires Eldia to use the rumbling, these three will need to be prepared to die for their country by allowing themselves to be eaten by the Queen's pure Titan. In the process, Historia would become a royal-blooded Titan shifter, but this would only ever happen if a path to peace becomes impossible. This solution is better than forcing Historia to become the Beast just because Zeke is running out of time, and it leaves open the possibility that she can live a full life without ever needing to be Titanized. Furthermore, with Erwin about to step into Zachary's role, his main focus as Commander-in-Chief will be improving diplomatic and economic relations with other countries, so that they never have to use this nuclear option. I think at first, Hitch would be too stunned to speak about this proposal, while Flock and Louise would be more likely to accept that they might have to be sacrificed. Meanwhile, Historia would begin to tell the group her thoughts on the plan, but before she can finish their sentence, a random soldier bursts in to tell them something's wrong. The soldier would go on to reveal that at this moment, their hidden facility in the mountains is under attack, with an unknown enemy raining down bullets from the airships. What the scouts wouldn't know though is that on the inside of this facility, a familiar face has taken advantage of all the chaos and managed to infiltrate the prison. Dressed up in the Survey Corps uniform, Peak would come face to face with Zeke for the first time since he turned Mr. Finger into a pure Titan. Although he wouldn't be able to speak because he has a gag in his mouth, she'd revealed to him that ever since they first met, it always felt like he was lying, but despite that, she never considered that he'd betray the warriors. The fact that after everything they've been through together, he was still willing to get Reiner, Porco and her father all killed, it's proof to her that he's an objectively evil person who deserves everything that's about to happen. Going beyond their personal grudge, the Coordinate is a power that also can't be trusted in the hands of the Jaeger brothers, and so Peak would bite her thumb to transform into the Cart Titan. In this form, she pounces forward to kill him by crunching through his spine, and she snaps off the top half of his body. As she chews into him, she technically merges the Cart Titan and the Beast Titan into one, but more importantly, by doing this she's taken away Eldia's most powerful weapon, which sets the stage for the Global Alliance to make their next move. By chewing through his spine, she merges the strength of their two shifters into one, and more importantly, Zeke's death means that Eldia has lost its only Titan of royal blood. Without that power, it's now physically impossible for Eren to activate the rumbling, meaning that the rest of the Global Alliance can now attack the island without the fear of their countries being trampled. Meanwhile in Shiganshina, Erwin would be in a meeting with Historia and the Titan Shifter unit, but they'd be interrupted by a random soldier bursting into the room. The soldier would reveal that minutes ago, a transmission was received from Zeke's location, in which a guard confirmed they were taking fire from foreign airships. News like that would definitely get a strong reaction from everyone in the room, with Eren in particular being more furious than anyone. It's not that he's necessarily worried about Zeke, but rather Eren knows that if something bad happens to his brother, then the military will replace him by turning Historia into a royal-blooded Titan. That's why he'd be so angry in this moment, because by the enemy targeting the prison, the knock-on effect is that it puts her in danger as well. As a result, Eren would turn to the commander and demand that they save the Beast Titan, because if his sibling is still alive, then the Jaeger Bros can activate the rumbling once and for all. Louise and Flock would also be in full support of this idea, but by now Erwin would have a different plan since he's realized something that no one else has. Like I mentioned earlier, Zeke's location was a state secret, meaning the only people who knew the coordinates were high-ranking military officials, high-ranking members of the Azumabito clan, and obviously the guards who were working there. Therefore, for the prison to be attacked, at least one person from these groups must have betrayed the island. For that reason, Erwin suspects that either Historia or Eren will be the enemy's next target, and he'd want them both to stay far, far away from the prison. Instead, the commander himself and Flock will be the ones to travel to the jail to potentially save Zeke, while all the other shifters will stay behind to protect the Queen. Now, switching over to the Global Alliance for a second, after receiving confirmation of Zeke's death, the rest of their forces would begin approaching Eldia from the south. These forces would include dozens of powerful warships, as well as a fleet of aircrafts that would be making their way towards the walls. On board one of these aircrafts would be Willy Tybur, who has a personal grudge against Eren for killing his sister back in Liberia. As we saw in part 3, part of the reason he helped to form this global alliance was because he and Pete wanted to avenge their family who were murdered by the scouts. In Pete's case, she now has that revenge for her father's death after killing both Zeke and Jean, but Willy's revenge won't be complete until they finally deal with Eren himself. Anyway, about an hour later, the Alliance's airships would arrive in Shiganshina, causing the local civilians to go into mass panic. Huge crowds of innocent people would run away from the invasion, and it wouldn't take long for the sounds of their screams to be heard inside the fort. This place is where the shifter unit would be watching over Historia, but after hearing all the chaos outside, Eren would go to the window to take a look. On the streets, he'd see thousands of his fellow islanders running for their lives, while in the sky there'd be a bunch of foreign soldiers parachuting out of airships. Immediately, Eren would notice a few strange things about these soldiers, with the first being that they have large mysterious packages strapped to their backs. From a distance, it'd be hard for him to tell what exactly these packages are, but given there are so many of them, it's obviously not going to be anything good. Within minutes, the enemy would then use these handles to maneuver themselves so that every single one of them lands on top of Walmaria. In that way, the whole of Shiganshina would now be surrounded by enemy fighters standing on the wall, which sets the stage for the next phase of this attack. Through the window, Historia and the others would watch on in disbelief as the mysterious packages turn out to actually be people. All across the wall, the Alliance soldiers would force these people to kneel in front of them, in a moment that would remind Eren of things he's witnessed in his father's past memories. Just like in those memories, the people in the present day would be violently injected against their will, indicating that they're most likely subjects of Ymir. Following the injection, their bodies would be kicked towards the ground, which is a 50-meter drop, and as they fall down, the entire district will light up from literally every direction. A second later, countless pure titans would rain onto the houses below, causing many civilian casualties just from the impact alone. By smashing into the surface, it'd create massive amounts of debris that would just fly everywhere, and as people continue to panic, it's unavoidable that some unlucky individuals would get trampled by the crowd. At the same time, although 1 or 2 pure titans might have died from the fall, the vast majority of them would begin rampaging through the town, with Willy Tybur observing this massacre from his airship. By this point, you're likely wondering how all of this destruction benefits him, and the answer is that it's part of his strategy to lure out the founding titan. Thanks to the traitor that's been passing on information, Willie knew that today, the shifter unit was scheduled to have a meeting somewhere in Shiganshina. With all of Eldia's shifters being in one place on one day, it presented the Alliance with a great chance to wipe them out, and these pure titans are the key to making that happen. By unleashing them into the district, Willie suspects that Eren won't be able to just stand by and watch, meaning it's only a matter of time until the Attack Titan and the other shifters reveal themselves. When it comes to Erwin, he and Flock would have spent the last hour riding as fast as they can, alongside Levi, Sasha, and a handful of other scouts. As we know, their primary aim right now is to save the Beast Titan, but in the time that it's taken for them to travel, Flock would start to have doubts about whether this mission is a lost cause. In spite of that, Erwin would remind everyone that even if it's too late to save Zeke, they can still achieve their secondary objective of finding out who the enemy is. Eventually, after enough riding, the group would make it to the prison, and upon arrival they notice foreign soldiers standing guard, as well as several airships circling overhead. This would cause Erwin to become majorly skeptical about the enemy's intentions, because they're actively choosing to hang around rather than trying to escape with the Beast Titan. In order to find out what's really going on, the commander would devise a plan to infiltrate the jail, which involves him and Flock using their titans. An important thing that the commander would know about this prison is that it has two separate entrances, one in this area near the front and a different one towards the back. Therefore, Erwin's plan is to cause such a huge distraction in this area that the enemy would have no choice but to focus all their energy in that direction. This would give Levi and the others time to fight their way through the back entrance and hopefully find Zeke in the process. To get things started, the commander would run out into the open field in full view of the enemy soldiers, and he'd be charging at the base in his human form. By making himself this visible, it would instantly put all of the Alliance's attention on him, with more soldiers gathering near the front to see what's going on. As he runs further and further into the field, Peak would desperately order the Alliance to fire their anti-Titan cannons, but before they can do that, Erwin would activate a lightning-fast transformation. In his Colossal Titan form, the commander would reach out to all the airships that were circling the prison, and one by one he'd smash them to pieces. Meanwhile, on the ground, Flock would initiate the next stage of this plan as he transforms into the Armored Titan and sprints towards the main entrance. Within a few seconds, he'd be using his bare hands to smash through several of the enemy cannons and soldiers, and Levi and Sasha would use this distraction to sneak into the jail. However, while Flock continues his rampage, he'd eventually be caught by surprise as these two soldiers manage to fire at him from point blank range. In this scenario, there simply wouldn't be enough space for the Armored Titan to evade the attack, and the armor-piercing bullet would tear through his body. To be specific, the bullet would pierce through both of Flock's human legs, and as he stumbles backwards, another shot would be fired that would narrowly miss his spine. Up in the sky, Erwin would see all of this happening, and regardless of what the mission is, he'd know that he needs to do something to prevent these soldiers firing again. If the Armored Titan is killed here, then there's no guarantee Eldia will ever get it back, and so the commander would quickly intervene by stomping the entire front entrance of the prison. Doing this would be a risky move since the debris could have potentially hurt Sasha and the others, but luckily for them they'd already be underground by now and would be approaching the chamber where Zeke was killed. Back on the surface, Erwin's new priority is checking that Flock is alive, and so his Colossal Titan would begin to kneel down as he prepares to exit his shifter. The commander would be completely surrounded by smoke as his human body begins to emerge, but just as he's doing that, a strange looking Titan would ambush him out of nowhere. This creature would lunge towards Erwin with its mouth wide open, and at this moment there's no way he'd be able to react in time. Anyhow, while that was happening, over in Shiganshina, Eren would be single-handedly fighting against a swarm of Titans. Considering that in this timeline he's had over half a year to practice with his Warhammer abilities, it shouldn't be too surprising that he'd know how to create a handful of different things. In this particular situation, he'd use the hardening to generate a sword, as a weapon like this makes it very simple to decapitate the pure Titans. Simultaneously, inside the fort there'd be a ton of scouts getting themselves ready, with Mikasa being desperate to join the action before Eren gets himself killed. In a different section of the fort, Historia would be looking out the window as the Attack Titan continues to fight, and she'd be thinking back to the last conversation they had before he left. During that conversation, Historia would have begged him not to go outside, as she'd have a much more effective way of stopping the enemy. Her proposal was that right now they turn her into a Titan of Royal Blood, which would allow Eren to use the coordinate like he did 4 years ago. With that power, he'd have been able to take control of all Titans in Shiganshina and stop them from eating people, and Eren would even have to acknowledge that this is the most rational thing to do. However, when it came down to it, he wouldn't be able to accept the idea of her being sacrificed, especially after he's already lost so many people who were close to him. That's why he'd run outside to fight the Global Alliance by himself, because he knew that the longer he stayed inside the fort, the more likely Historia would be to give herself the injection. Now, in case you're wondering about Louise and Hitch, these two would have stayed behind to protect the Queen, which is exactly what Erwin asked them to do before he left. That being said, the situation has changed a lot since then, and after watching Eren behead Titans for about 10 minutes, Hitch would decide that she wants to get involved. It's worth remembering that in the main timeline, this character thought that her most meaningful job as a soldier was when she was pulling bodies out of the rubble. Following that logic, in this new timeline she'd find even greater meaning in using her Titan powers to save lives, given that she can help more people than she ever could as a human. For that reason, after apologizing to Historia, Hitch would exit the fort and immediately transform into her female Titan. She'd then run through Shiganshina until she finally reaches Eren, and as the two of them come face to face, he'd throw his Warhammer sword in her direction. Like we already mentioned, this thing is way easier for slicing the nape, and he'd pass it to Hitch because this is her first time fighting pure Titans in real life. Soon after this, the Attack Titan would create a new weapon to replace the one he gave away, and this time around he'd form a bow and arrow to destroy the airships above. Earlier in the fight, he wouldn't have needed this weapon since there were just pure Titans attacking him from every direction, but now that Hitch is here, he's trusting her to take care of the close range threats so that he can eliminate the airships overhead. From above, Willy would have been watching all these events unfold, and up till this point he'd have found it really disturbing to see Eren using his dead sister's abilities. In spite of that, with the Attack Titan now using the bow and arrow, Willy would realize that there isn't any more time to stand around, and he'd get the ball rolling on the final phase of his revenge plan. Seconds later, both he and Magath would parachute out the sky, and as they descend towards Walmaria, Eren would use his arrows to blow up all the remaining ships. Meanwhile, over by the prison, Erwin would be about to get swallowed by this mysterious Titan, but at the last moment Levi would swoop in to save his life. A minute earlier, the scouts would have emerged from the underground after finding Zeke's remains, and they'd arrive on the surface just in time to see Pieck transform. Her new hybrid Titan would be a mixture of the cart and beast, and as she lunged forward to eat the commander, that's when Levi would react. Following this, the captain would charge at Pieck pretty much straight away, because as we saw in part 3, he has a personal vendetta against her for killing Hanji. As a result, he'd see this encounter as the perfect chance to make her suffer, but from the sidelines, Erwin would try to remind him that she needs to be taken alive. The commander would be eager to learn more about who the warrior is working with and what their motivations are, but the injured flock would argue that this shouldn't be a priority. With Zeke now being dead, the entire island is at risk, so he'd argue that they should let Levi deal with Pieck, while the rest of them travel back home to make Historia into a Titan. In normal circumstances, they might have been able to send a transmission to warn her about the situation, but when Erwin stomped on the prison, it destroyed the only radio they could have used. Therefore, Flock's proposal would be to quickly travel back to Shiganshina, and if they're lucky they'll make it to the Queen before the enemy does. After considering this proposal, the commander would accept that titanizing Historia is by far the most urgent thing for humanity, and so he and the rest of the scouts would begin their journey back to the walls. At the same time, Levi would be left with the sole responsibility of defeating the Cart Titan, and Erwin would give him orders to bring her back alive if possible. Switching back to Eren and Hitch, these two would continue to stand strong against the Pure Titans, and they'd be supported by dozens of scouts all across the district. However, what nobody on the ground would be aware of is that on top of Walmaria, Magath would be finished setting up his anti-Titan sniper rifle. Just like in the main series, this character would want revenge for everything that happened in Liberia, but beyond that, he'd also want to save the world by defeating the founding Titan. Of course, the problem here is that if Magath was to just kill Eren, then the founder would be inherited by a random Eldian baby somewhere in the world. That might potentially cause trouble for them in the future, so the better option is for the Alliance to steal the coordinate for themselves. The first step to making that happen is for Eren to be eaten by one of these random Titans, and Magath would need to use his rifle to set things in motion. To start things off, he'd aim for the Attack Titan's head and fire off a super precise shot that would disable Eren's ability to move. This would leave him incredibly vulnerable, but the Pure Titan still wouldn't be able to get close due to the female Titan constantly wiping them out. In order to solve this issue, Magath would ask for his rifle to be reloaded, and after a few seconds of concentration, his next shot would blow out the female Titan's nape. This bullet would completely shred through Hitch's human body, killing her almost instantly, and inside the fort, Louise and Historia would have been watching the whole thing. Anyway, when it comes to Levi and Pieck, these two would have been fighting each other for a while, and the captain would be trying his best to finish her off. His main goal here would be to slice off her human limbs, but so far, every single time he'd get close, Pieck would eject herself from her Titan and then generate a new one. Thanks to the cart having nearly unlimited stamina, she could keep going for as long as she needs to, and after doing this around 6 or 7 times, Levi would be so exhausted that he'd start to lose composure. Realizing that his reactions are slowing down, Peak would take advantage of this weakness by abandoning the fight. The truth is that she never would have had an interest in battling Levi to the death, as she was more concerned with preventing Erwin and Flock from returning to Shiganshina. Her goal would be to kill the Armored and Colossal Titans before they make it back to the walls, which would be her way of honoring Reiner and Bertolt's memory. Even though the scouts had a big head start, Peak's Beast Titan would enable her to track the smell of Flock's blood, and her shifter would be a lot faster than the galloping horse. For that reason, she'd eventually catch up to the group while they were in a forest near the walls, and the very first person she'd target would be the commander. Being the leader that he is though, he'd order the other scouts to keep charging forward regardless of what happens to him, especially Sasha, who'd have been carrying the injured Flock this whole time. In Flock's current condition, he just wouldn't have the energy to become the Armored Titan, while Erwin himself transformed too recently to be able to do it again. Because of that, he'd be a sitting duck as Peak lunges forward to kill him, and as he braces himself to get swallowed, a bright white light would suddenly flash before his eyes. When the light disappears, the Cart Titan and everything else around him would vanish, while the sky itself would abruptly change from day to night. In this night sky, there'd be a strange aura unlike anything the commander has seen in his life, not to mention mountains of sand that would surround him for miles. After seeing all this, Erwin's first thought would be that he must be dead, since the last thing he'd remember was Peak chasing after him. He then began to wonder if this is some kind of illusion, and as he continues to think about all the possibilities, his train of thought would be interrupted by Erwin. From behind, he'd approach the commander with a depressing look on his face, and Erwin would turn to ask him what this place is and whether he was the one that brought them there. Erwin would simply reply by confirming that he wasn't the one that did this, and as Erwin now fully turns around, he'd witness Historia approaching him from the other side. In the current moment, there were still hundreds of Titans rampaging through the district, creating a genuine risk that the founder might be eaten if even one of them manages to slip past the scouts. For the sake of the island's future, Historia would realize that if Erwin dies, then so does everyone else, and it's why in a moment of desperation, she'd explain to Louise her last-ditch solution to save him. Meanwhile, on the outside, the Global Alliance would be closely observing the situation, as the Survey Corps struggle to deal with a huge amount of pure Titans. Assuming this continues, then it's only a matter of time until the Alliance can steal the founder, so for now, all Magath has to do is just keep aiming at the attack Titan's brain. However, around 10 minutes later, Willy would start to get suspicious, as down on the ground, a worn-out looking Historia would slowly be stumbling through the streets of Shiganshina. Directly above her, Mikasa would be slashing any nearby pure Titans, almost like she was clearing a path for them to reach Eren. From Willy's perspective, a move like this wouldn't make any sense, since he received intel confirming that Historia is just a normal person who Eren would have never allowed to inherit any Titan abilities. That intel was reliable as it came from the same spy who gave them Zeke's location, but despite everything, Willy could see those unmistakable Titan marks under her eyes. Based on this, he'd instantly tell Magath to shoot to stop her making contact with Eren, and although the commander would want to do it, there's a good reason why he'd hesitate. Of all people, Magath is clever enough to realize that if he kills her now, then there'll be no more people of royal blood left on the planet, and if that happens, then the Founding Titan can never be activated again. This is a big problem for him, since for Marley to reclaim their place in the world, they need access to this power, which is why they secretly had plans to capture Historia after they had captured the founder itself. Killing her now would also kill Marley's one hope of regaining the dominance they used to have, and this brief hesitation is what gave Connie time to catch Magath by surprise. As the commander's body evaporates after being hit with a thunder spear, back on ground level, an exhausted Historia lifts her finger towards Eren's Titan foot. This faint contact between the founder and a Titan of royal blood immediately teleports them both into the past dimension, where they manifest in front of the coordinate. Initially, Eren would be the most confused about where they are, because although he's obviously heard about paths, he's never seen this landscape for himself. By contrast, Historia is the one who does already know this place, given that 5 years ago she saw visions of the coordinate through Ymir's memories. After a short awkward silence, Eren would then turn to ask her how they were able to get here, to which Historia replies by explaining what happened in Shiganshina. With the survival of the entire island on the line, Louise made the ultimate sacrifice by passing down the Jaw Titan to someone of royal blood. Before Historia can even finish the story though, Eren interrupts her to ask her why she would do this, since in his opinion, Mikasa and the scouts could have handled the pure Titans. From his point of view, this was a pointless sacrifice of Louise's life and more importantly Historia's life, because from this point forward she only has 13 years left to live. As he continues to lash out, suddenly a young girl emerges from the coordinate itself, forcing them to temporarily switch their attention. Although Historia wouldn't have any clue who this mystery girl is, for some reason her memories would flash back to the time when Frieda was teaching her how to read. Back then, we saw how one of her favourite book characters was a girl called Krista, and in the present day, she get the feeling that somehow this girl is connected to that particular memory. Soon afterwards, the girl in question would then kneel down to Erwin and Historia, causing a surprised Erwin to respond by asking who she is. As he then kneels down to put his hand on her shoulder, something pretty interesting would happen, as all of the founder's memories abruptly begin flowing into his head. For that split moment in time, the two of them would gain an almost complete understanding of each other, with Erwin experiencing her pain and acknowledging her desire to be freed from 2,000 years of slavery. Slowly getting back to his feet, he'd explain to Historia that this girl is the original founding Titan Ymir, and due to her obedience to the royal bloodline, Historia is the only one who can use her full potential. A revelation like that would be totally unexpected, but after taking a minute to process, Historia would wonder what Ymir can actually do. It's likely that one of the first things she'd ask is whether Commander Erwin can be summoned to this dimension, partly because she'd want his guidance on what to do next, but also because she'd want to know what happened with the mission to save Zeke. This request from Historia is how Erwin ends up manifesting out of the blue, and it wouldn't take long for them all to fill each other in on what's been happening. During the conversation, the commander would learn all about the chaos in Shiganshina, including the deaths of Hitch and Louise, while Erwin and Historia would learn about his situation in the real world. With Erwin literally about to die as soon as he leaves this dimension, he'd make it clear that before that happens, they need to think of a plan to save the Eldian people. This leads to an intense discussion about their strategy going forward, with the characters having different perspectives on how to use the Founder's power. In Erwin's case, he'd propose that now's finally the time to do a full-scale rumbling, where they can unleash the Wall Titans to trample all life outside the island. A global massacre on this scale would guarantee that future generations would be able to live in peace, and it would also mean that they no longer rely on Titan powers for their survival. Erwin would argue that the outside world has taken the lives of so many people they care about, including Armin, Jean, Hanji, and countless others, and so the only way to stop this cycle of death is to put an end to everything. Immediately though, Erwin would disagree, partly because a full-scale rumbling would mean wiping out their allies. Over the past 5 years, the Azumabito have held the island in a ton of different ways, and if it wasn't for their resources, the scouts never would have been able to beat the Marlians. On top of that, Eldia has an existing peace agreement with one of the smaller Middle Eastern nations, with the commander believing that larger countries in the region might be convinced to do the same. To him, the idea of destroying their potential allies with the rumbling would be a pointless waste of human life, and instead he'd propose that they do a partial rumbling to crush the global alliance. Once that's done, the entire world will know the power of the Founder is real, and from there, Eldia can use diplomacy to establish themselves on the world stage. On this issue, Historia would also fully agree with the commander's approach, since if successful it would save the island and give them a voice in the international community. However, Erwin would aggressively reply by claiming that Erwin's plan can never work because their supposed allies have already betrayed them. Back in Shiganshina, he noticed how the anti-Titan cannons used by Magath were exactly like the ones produced by the Middle East, and when it comes to Zeke, his secret location was discovered by the Global Alliance, even though the Azumabito were the only ones outside the island who knew. In Erwin's mind, this would be proof that no one outside the walls has any loyalty to Eldia, and their allies won't hesitate to betray them if it serves their own best interests. A worldwide rumbling would therefore solve this problem by creating a future where none of their enemies exist, and in this moment he turned to Historia to ask her why she doesn't understand. The Queen would respond by telling him that she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she killed billions of innocent people, and just as she says those words, the surrounding environment would begin to change. Thanks to Ymir's power, Historia would transport the three of them into her own memories, where she'd reveal that since arriving in Pars, her head keeps flashing back to the time she spent with her older sister. As we already know, Frida was objectively the kindest member of the royal family, and was the only one who took the time to visit Historia during her terrible childhood. Years afterwards, when Historia herself then became the queen, she tried to emulate her sister by opening an orphanage and spending time with kids who had no other family. In that sense, it was Frida who showed her how to be the person she is today, and Historia would believe that if Frida was in her current situation, there's no way she'd ever agree to Erwin's plan. Following that comment, there'd be an awkward moment of silence where he just quietly stands there thinking, before suddenly the environment abruptly morphs into the Rice Chapel. This rapid change would catch both Erwin and Historia completely by surprise, but for Erwin, he'd just start talking again as if nothing happened. Out of nowhere, he'd admit to them that 5 years ago at the medal ceremony, he saw a vision of the future through his dad's memories. That future vision was unlocked specifically because he touched Historia, and now in the present day, Historia is the one that's brought him back to Pars to relive the whole moment again. As the three of them observe from a distance, they witness Grisha arriving to confront the royals, while Frida's conflicted mind gets taken over by the will of Karl Fritz. Seeing this takeover happen, Erwin would claim that if Frida had never been brainwashed by the king, then she would have done anything to save her siblings, even if that meant activating the rumbling. He'd argue that although Historia might not want to believe it, the real Frieda was determined to save humanity by eliminating the Titans, so if she knew that their true enemy was humanity instead, then odds are she'd want to eliminate them as well. Seconds later, as Grisha falls to his knees in hesitation, Eren would forcefully tell him to stand up, and thanks to the Attack Titan's future memory inheritance, Grisha in the past would actually receive the message. In this way, Eren is able to motivate his dad to wipe out the Rice bloodline, while the helpless Historia can only watch on as her family are massacred right in front of her. When the carnage finally comes to an end, Eren would begin to explain that from the time he made contact with Ymir, he understood the founder on a personal level. This understanding made him realize that to free Ymir from this prison and to save the Eldian people, the rumbling is the only option left for them to take. As he continues, he'd go on to confess that Historia never really had control over the founder, since the vow to renounce war applies on some level to any person of royal blood. In the main series, Zeke confirmed this when he said it took him a mind-numbing amount of time to override the vow and make Ymir obey him, and in this timeline, Historia simply never had the chance to do that. Consequently, Eren chose to let her believe that she was in control, because he wanted to test if having the founder's power would give her the same realization that he had. Despite his best efforts though, neither she or Erwin was convinced by his plan, forcing him to go ahead with this by himself. As the three of them then materialized back in Paz, Eren would begin walking towards the coordinate, while Erwin and Historia would be chained up by Ymir. Unable to move, Historia would scream at Eren not to go through with this, since ending all life outside the walls isn't exactly the only solution to Eldia's problems. Meanwhile, Erwin would try to break free from the chains around his wrists, but in this case his conviction wouldn't be strong enough for him to actually escape. Although he'd agree with Historia that a full-scale rumbling is wrong, he'd also realize that stopping Eren at this point would put the whole island at risk. Being commander of the scouts, he wouldn't want his final action to be one that potentially dooms the Eldian race, and for that reason he'd stay in chains as Eren keeps walking towards the paths. Instantaneously, a giant lightning bolt would then strike the Attack Titan in the real world, while across Eldia the three walls would start to crumble. All over the country, unsuspecting civilians would be crushed by the falling debris, as the millions of Colossal Titans emerge for the first time in over a century. At the same time, the rampaging Pure Titans in Shiganshina would be struck by lightning as well, and when the smoke finally clears, every last one of them would have reverted back into human form. Remember, these people were just innocent Eldians who were blindfolded and brought here by the Global Alliance, and so most of them wouldn't have any idea about where they are. To save their lives and the lives of his fellow scouts, Eren used the Founder's power to undo every transformation in the world except for himself and his army of Titans. This single action is what turned them back into humans, and in a nearby forest it also had some pretty big consequences. With Erwin back in the real world and literally about to be eaten, the Cart Titan would get hit with a bright flash that engulfs her entire body. This lightning would be so powerful that the blowback knocks the scouts off their horses, and in the chaos it'd definitely take a few minutes for them to understand what just happened. Just like in Shiganshina, there'd be thick smoke covering the whole area, but as Erwin cautiously begins to walk through the cloud, he'd be stunned to find Peak's broken body on the ground. Elements come together. Okay, so part 6 starts off in Liberia, which is a place that would still be rebuilding after it was mostly destroyed during the war 7 months ago. In the present day, an excited looking Falco would be running towards Gabi and Zafir because he'd received an important letter addressed to all warrior candidates. What makes this letter special is that it was personally written to them by Peak, who's someone they haven't seen or heard from since her, Magath and Willy Tybur had to flee the country. Ever since that night, Mali's government has been under the control of Hizuru, which is why the Cart Titan was never able to send any messages. Inside her letter though, she'd explain how the political situation has drastically changed, with many countries, including Hizuru, forming a secret alliance against Eren. If everything goes to plan, this global alliance will soon capture the Founding Titan, and might also reclaim the other shifters that were stolen from Mali. This is the news that got Falco excited because it means his older brother still has a chance of inheriting the Beast Titan, but in Gabi's case her priorities would be totally different. In the past year, all of her immediate family has been killed by the scouts, with her cousin Reiner being eaten by Flock, her aunt Karina being blown up by Eren, and her parents being crushed by the falling debris. At the time of their deaths, Gabi was deployed in the Middle East alongside the rest of the Eldian unit, and so she never got the chance to help her family or say goodbye to anyone. This led to her being essentially cursed by a never-ending feeling of guilt, and gradually her desire to become a warrior became overshadowed by her desire to get revenge. In her mind, the only thing she wants the Global Alliance to do is give every island devil the most painful deaths imaginable, but just as the words leave her mouth, the three of them would abruptly manifest in the past dimension. Out of nowhere, Gabi, Zafir and Falco would hear the voice of Eren Yeager, who introduces himself to the entire Eldian race by using the power of the coordinate. During this speech, he'd explained that in response to the island being recently attacked, it's proven to him that it's impossible to have peace between Eldia and the outside world. Therefore, to finally put an end to this cycle of hate, he's unleashed millions of Colossal Titans with the intention of wiping out every last enemy across the ocean. This declaration of mass murder would also be heard by the population back on the island, and later that evening, Premier Zachary would call an emergency meeting. In the process, Zachary would hear about how Eren gained Ymir's power and reversed the transformation of all Titans, making him virtually invincible. At this point, there's no person or weapon on the planet that has any chance of stopping him, but from Flock's perspective, that wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. The Armored Titan would argue that even if they could somehow stop the rumbling, it would only put Eldia in a more dangerous position than they were before. In his opinion, any nation that survives this will inevitably rise up against them in the future, and so the safest option for their survival is to let Eren trample everything. However, although Erwin would see the cold logic in what Flock is saying, he'd tell the group that letting billions of people die shouldn't be what they want. In the years before humanity knew the outside world existed, there was still violence, inequality, and conspiracies happening within the three worlds themselves. Bearing that in mind, eradicating all life outside the island will never be the final answer to their problems, and Erwin would admit that he wasted his one chance to stop Eren when they were in paths. This would cause Historia to angrily respond, claiming that they can't just give up, since she suspects that anyone, even Eren, would have doubts about murdering the whole human race. If the scouts can reach him before he goes too far with this, then she can once again use her royal blood to bring them into paths again and hopefully talk things out. Immediately though, Erwin would ask how they'd reach Eren in the first place, given that the rumbling is faster than any vehicle on the island. To outpace the Founding Titan, they need something like Hizaru's flying boat, but currently the only ones that exist are with the Azumabito clan. Following a brief pause, Historia would reveal something that happened to her in Shiganshina soon after she ate the Jaw Titan. In the moment when she was lying unconscious, the Queen saw memories from a previous Titan shifter, but at the time she had no idea who the girl was. It was only after personally meeting Ymir that Historia realized a connection, since the girl in her vision had the exact same hollow eyes, and so did her two siblings. Based on the context, the Queen would now be certain that she saw the memories of Rose Fritz, commonly known as the second child of Ymir, and apparently the first ever Jaw Titan. In these flashbacks, Historia saw various snapshots of Rose's life, but by far the most clear vision was one of her flying over the battlefield. For whatever reason, Historia would have the innate feeling that she could do the same thing, maybe because she's also a member of the royal family, or possibly because Louise's Jaw Titan was created using the Beast Titan spinal fluid. Whatever the answer might be, the power to fly is something that she'd feel her Titan could be able to do, and Zachary would remark how this makes reaching Eren a possibility. This comment would cause Flock to have an outburst at the Commander-in-Chief, as he'd remind everyone that interfering with Eren could mean the death of the Eldian race, but before his speech goes any further, Erwin would cut him off to explain what they should do next. His plan is that tomorrow morning, Historia needs to test if she can really fly, and if the theory is true, then they'll come up with a strategy to locate the Founding Titan. The commander would reassure Flock that no matter what happens, they don't have any intentions of hurting Eren, but rather they're just gonna find him and hopefully reason with him. Feeling outnumbered, the Armored Titan would accept this proposal, although secretly he wouldn't be feeling too great about the whole situation. As the meeting then comes to an end, Zachary would ask about Willy, Tiber and Peak, to which Erwin would confirm that they're being held as prisoners underground. Up until now, they've both refused to say anything, but in the morning, he and Levi are going to try again to get some answers. In the meantime though, the commander's main priority is dealing with all the Eldian refugees, who were used as weapons by the Global Alliance prior to being turned back into humans by Eren. Hours later, as the Wall Titans continued to march through the night, Mikasa would lay in bed questioning how all of this could happen. From her point of view, the real Eren would never trample innocent women and children, and so she tried to rationalize his actions by telling herself that Ymir must be controlling him. As Mikasa moves from one explanation to the next, Connie and Sasha would be making their way to Ragako village. Thanks to Eren undoing the transformation of every Titan, the two of them would have hope that Mrs. Springer also reverted into human form. For the past 5 years, she's been stuck in Ragako as an upside-down Titan, so if Eren really has ended her suffering, then that act of kindness would be enough to earn Connie's undying loyalty. Meanwhile, over in Shiganshina, Flock would have fallen asleep to the sound of the rumbling, and in his dreams he'd manifest in front of a tree. At the bottom of this tree would be an old grave covered in cracks, but as he leans closer, he noticed the name inscribed on it is none other than Eren Yeager. In his confusion, he'd keep staring at the headstone to make sure he's reading it correctly, but he'd soon get distracted by the objects flying overhead. As Flock turns around, he'd see a futuristic city in ruins, with strangely shaped aircrafts relentlessly dropping bombs all over the place. These bombs would cause the buildings to fall apart, and in the blink of an eye he'd be transported to the streets of an empty Shiganshina. Seeing the town in this state would remind him of how it looked 5 years ago, when he and Erwin were nearly killed here by the Beast Titan. Flock would think to himself that Eldia should never be allowed to end up in ruin like this again, and after suddenly waking up, he'd feel certain about what he has to do. To prevent his home from falling into ruin at the hands of the invaders, it's his responsibility to make sure Eren survives no matter what. The next morning, down in the prison cells, Pieck would wake up to the sight of Levi and the commander hanging around outside. Next to her, Willy would already be awake, but he'd still be too traumatized to speak after witnessing the rumbling firsthand. Without wasting any time, Levi would then begin interrogating the Cart Titan, because he'd want to know how she found out Zeke's location. Remember, only the highest ranking people like Zachary and Erwin were aware of its location. In fact, even the captain himself didn't know where it was until yesterday. For that reason, he'd want to know how a foreigner from Mali got a hold of that information, but during the questioning, Pieck would stay totally silent. This is when Erwin would jump in, as he tried to get a reaction by telling both prisoners the rumbling is their fault for attacking the island. The Cart Titan would respond by glaring directly at him, and after getting her attention, the commander would slightly change his tone. In a moment of honesty, he'd reveal that he personally didn't want this to happen, and although Eldia has no method of stopping Eren by force, there's still a chance that they might be able to save some lives. Looking Pieck in the eyes, he'd ask her if she still has people in Mali that she wants to save, causing her to think back to the young warrior candidates. The Cart Titan would feel like a failure for giving them false hope with that letter, since by now Gabi, Falco and the rest must have worked out the Global Alliance was defeated. At the same time, Willy would think about his wife and his many children, and the mental image of them getting trampled by the rumbling would make him want to throw up. Following this, Erwin would claim that despite being enemies, he's willing to save their families if they tell him what he needs to know. Pieck would reply by asking why they should trust him, but before she could finish, a desperate Willy confesses that it was Kiyomi who told them Zeke's location. For several years, Hizuru have been desperate to improve their global reputation, but after invading Mali, things hadn't been going as well as they expected. This is largely because Willy had been using his political and media connections to turn the world against her, with the Azumabito getting hit with economic sanctions. Gradually, Kiyomi became so desperate to turn things around that when Willy contacted her, she was more than willing to listen to his proposal. The deal they agreed was that in exchange for her passing on vital information, Hizuru would gain two things. Number one, they'd no longer be viewed as friends of the Eldian Empire, which meant no more economic sanctions. And number two, in the future they'd gain exclusive access to Eldia's natural resources. Erwin would reply, pointing out that the Azumabito already have access to the Iceburst Stone, but Willy would explain that Hizuru wanted all of the reserves. If the Global Alliance had been successful in their plan to steal the founder, it was Ambassador Kiyomi who then planned to take full control over the island. After hearing that revelation, Erwin would feel an incredible sense of disappointment since his biggest ally turned out to be a traitor just like Eren predicted. This would cause the commander to rethink whether they should even try to stop the rumbling, because without Hizuru's technology on their side, the island would become incredibly vulnerable when modern weapons surpass the power of the Titans. Noticing the look on Erwin's face, Willy would tell him there's still one path they can take where everyone survives, but it would involve making one sacrifice. To explain this plan, he'd start by confessing that he's always viewed being Eldian as a curse, and if it was up to him, he'd never have been born in the first place. Having said that, hearing Eren's declaration made him realize that he is afraid of dying, and more importantly, he doesn't want any of his kids to die either. Saving their lives is what matters to him more than anything else, and to accomplish that, he's willing to help Erwin in whatever way he can. The commander would question what exactly Willy is suggesting here, and this is when he'd reveal something pretty interesting. 100 years ago, the Tybert family took credit for defeating Karl Fritz, who was one of their previous founding titans, and from that moment they were all treated like royalty despite being Eldians. Thanks to the actions of his ancestors, Willy enjoyed a life where no one ever judged him for being a subject of Ymir, proving that humans and Eldians can trust each other under the right circumstances. Just like how the Tybers are widely known as heroes who save the planet, the same could happen for Erwin and the Scouts if they somehow stop the rumbling. To guarantee that no one lays a finger on the island, Willy could use his political influence to tell the story of how they saved humanity from extinction. His reputation as a Tiber would make people more willing to accept the Scouts as their saviors, but of course the sacrifice is that they'd have to kill Eren. Without Eren's death, the story would feel incomplete, as the world would still view Eldia as a threat to all of their lives. For that reason, the founding titan has to die, and most importantly, the Scouts have to be the ones to do it. A proposal like that would instantly catch Levi and Erwin by surprise, but before they can properly respond, a horrified Mikasa bursts into the room. Judging from the look on her face, the commander would wrongly assume that she just heard what Willy said, but in reality she didn't hear any of that, she was reacting to something else. While Erwin and Levi were down here in the prison, Mikasa and Flock spent the morning with Historia, testing whether the queen could really use her titan to fly. During these tests though, the Queen would accidentally do something that no one else was expecting, and Mikasa would beg the commander to come and take a look for himself. The following day, the rumbling would start to have an impact in all corners of the earth, with the Titan setting foot on multiple continents. Over in the Middle East, people would run for their lives as their whole civilization is crushed into the ground, while in Asia, Kiyomi's worst fear would become a reality. 2 days ago, she suspected something wasn't right when Hizuru lost contact with the Global Alliance, and that uneasy feeling was made worse when she heard rumors about Eldians receiving a message from Eren. In response, the Azumabito clan made extensive preparations to deal with any potential threat, mobilizing their flying boats, anti-Titan cannons, and warships. Sadly for them, this wouldn't be enough, as the Wall Titans would easily brush off every single attempt to slow them down, continuing to march full speed into Hizuru. As Kiyomi then watches her country get trampled to dust, she'd wonder what would have happened if she'd made a different decision. When Willy first approached her with his proposal, she agreed to help the Global Alliance since it seemed like it was the only way Hizuru would be accepted back onto the world stage. However, if she answered differently and decided to stick with Erwin and the scouts, then things probably wouldn't have come to this. In her final few seconds before the rumbling crushes her to death, Kiyomi would think briefly about Mikasa, cause as the only Asian living in Eldia, she'll be the last surviving member of the Azumabito clan. Now, switching back to Liberio, the ground would be violently shaking as the Titans make their way further into the city. A couple days earlier, when the Eldians heard Eren's message, they tried to convince the guards to let them escape, triggering a violent military response that led to several casualties. As a result, most people inside the internment zone became too afraid to speak up, and they chose to spend their final days with their families rather than fighting against the guards. In Gabby's case, she'd be spending time with Falco and the Grice family, and right now they'd all be terrified as the rumbling marches towards them. At the front of this march would be Eren, who's personally leading his army of Titans into Liberio, and the sight of the attack Titan would cause a stampede of people to run away. Gabby herself would stay frozen in fear, knowing there's no point trying to escape, but just as things seem their most hopeless, an unidentified creature quickly speeds through the sky. Seeing this from below, the young warrior candidate would instantly recognize it as a Titan, even though she's never seen anything like it. Colt would speculate that somehow this shifter might be Peak, cause to him she's the only person left who'd be willing to charge headfirst into the rumbling. The reality, however, is that this flying Titan is Historia, and riding on her back would be Erwin, Flock, Mikasa, and Captain Levi. Their mission right now is to peacefully convince Eren to stop the rumbling, and that means doing what they can to distract him while Historia tries to make contact. If successful, this would give them one final chance to talk things out in the past dimension, but in the back of Erwin and Levi's heads, they couldn't help but remember the warning they got from Willy Tiber. As the Jaw Titan then flies over the rumbling, her mouth would start to glow in a way that shocks everyone watching from inside the internment zone. Following a few seconds of build-up, Historia then releases a blast of superheated steam, vaporizing the napes of about a dozen Titans marching towards Liberio. Those Titans then fall to the ground, causing a chain reaction where other Titans start to fall over them, and it's at this point Gabby would feel a sense of hope for the first time. By the way, in case you're wondering how this ability works, similar to the Colossal, Historia is able to burn muscle mass to generate steam, but instead of emitting that steam, she can store it internally. When the heat then builds up to an excessive temperature, her Titan can release it in one go, melting pretty much anything that happens to be in the way. The downside to this power is that, like I said, she needs to burn muscle mass to do this, meaning there needs to be a long regeneration period before she can do it again. Anyway, with a whole section of Wall Titans being wiped out, Eren would be surprised and mildly impressed by the attempt to stop him. Based on what happened in Paz, he knew that Erwin and Historia weren't happy about his choice, but he never imagined they'd go out of their way to stand against him. What makes it worse is that Mikasa is also part of the group, and for a second, her presence would make him question if he's really doing the right thing. His primary motivation for doing the rumbling was to protect the few people he has left, but if those same people truly don't want him to do this, then it's at least something to think about. As Eren stays deep in thought, Erwin would then dramatically leap from Historia to activate his colossal transformation. The commander's job in this moment is to essentially be a distraction by blocking the attack Titan's path, giving the Jaw enough time to swoop in. Remember, all Historia has to do is make the faintest contact for her plan to succeed, and it's why Erwin would scream at the top of his lungs to try and get Eren's attention. Despite the commander's best efforts though, Eren's eyes would stay firmly fixed on Historia as he tries to assess what's going on. He knows that if the scouts were here to kill him, then there's no way Mikasa would be involved, but at the same time, if they're here to stop the rumbling, then there's no way they can do that without killing him. While Eren racks his brain trying to figure out what they're up to, Historia would suddenly pick up the speed, and within a few seconds she'd be inches away from making contact. A blinding flash of light would then engulf the Jaw Titan, but as the people of Liberio observe the situation, pretty quickly Erwin would realize something's wrong. The scale of this lightning would be 1,000 times larger than expected, since the last time Historia touched Erwin, she said there was only a tiny spark. This would cause Erwin to ask himself what could possibly be different, and to answer that question we need to flash back to their meeting with Zachary. During that conversation, Flock got the strange impression that the scouts care more about saving their enemies than they do about saving their own people. His paranoia got worse after having a dream of Eldia's future destruction, and so later that same night he made preparations to find out the truth. Knowing that Erwin would interrogate the prisoners from Mali, Flock paid one of the MPs to listen in and report everything back to him the following night. This meant that when Willie Tiber gave the commander a speech about needing to kill Erwin, one of the guards on duty was secretly spying for the Armored Titan. At no point did the guard hear Erwin or Levi reject Willie's proposal, and when you remember that Levi is immune to the Founder's mind control, killing Erwin is actually within the realm of possibility. In theory, all it takes is for someone of Ackerman blood to be brought face to face with the Attack Titan, and once they're physically there, nothing can stop them from slicing the nape. These are the thoughts that Flock would be telling himself after finding out what Willie said, and at this moment he knew that somehow he had to intervene. That's why he pretended to be a good soldier as the scouts moved forward in their mission to stop Erwin, and it's why in the second before Historia made contact, he found the courage to detonate his Titan. It was Flock's transformation into the armor that triggered this blinding flash of light, preventing Historia from touching Erwin while also blasting the Ackermans at close range. His intention here was to eliminate the last remaining threats to the rumbling, ensuring that future generations of Eldians won't suffer the same fate he saw in his dream. With the Ackermans gone, there's no one left on Earth who can stand against the Founder, and as Levi, Mikasa and Historia plummet towards the ground, Erwin and the commander would only be able to watch on in disbelief. So the best place to start this video off is with Mikasa, who'll slowly be waking up as the sun begins to set. In this moment, the last thing she'd remember is Flock trying to blow her up in Liberia, but strangely, she wouldn't have a single memory of anything that happened afterwards. As she then gradually opens her eyes, she noticed Erwin quietly standing ahead of her, and based on their surroundings, it'd be clear that somehow they've made it back to Shiganshina. This realization would cause a million questions to start going through Mikasa's head, but before she has time to even form a complete sentence, Erwin would begin to say something. Looking towards the sunset, he'd tell her that he's glad she's finally conscious, since he's been standing in this exact spot for weeks waiting for her to recover. The reason they came to this specific location is because it's the same hill where they always used to play as kids, and he thought that being here might subconsciously help her to wake up. However, with no recollection of even travelling to Paradise in the first place, she'd respond by just asking him how exactly they arrived back home. Immediately, that question would cause him to go silent, and he'd keep facing off into the distance, almost like he's afraid to look at her. His unusual behaviour would definitely give Mikasa a slightly uneasy feeling by this point, and as she repeats the question, she'd also ask whether Levi and Historia are okay. This would be followed by an even longer awkward silence, but after a while, Erwin would reluctantly have to turn around. The depressing look on his face would instantly let her know that something's wrong, but to explain why he's upset, we first need to understand the truth about what happened in Liberia. As we already know, Flock believed that the Ackermans were the only ones who could kill Erwin, and so to stop them from interfering with the rumbling, he detonated the Armored Titan. The blast was so powerful that any regular human would have been vaporized, but for Levi, Mikasa and Historia, they were still alive as they fell towards the ground. During that long 70-meter drop, Erwin tried his best to catch their unconscious bodies, but the slowness of his Titan meant that he was too far away to reach them in time. Meanwhile, Erwin's vision was partially clouded by all the smoke coming from the rumbling, meaning he didn't properly see the Ackermans until they'd nearly hit the floor. By then, it was way too late to intervene, and so, in a moment of desperation, he brought Mikasa to the past dimension, which, as you probably guessed, is where they are right now. In Path, he spent weeks waiting for her to recover, and as her body was being rebuilt, Erwin tried to think of different ways to save her in the real world. For example, one of his ideas was to transform her into a pure Titan to increase her chances of survival, but he had to give up on that plan and several other plans due to Ackermans being unaffected by the founding Titan. In the end, after considering basically every possibility, Erwin realized that he was once again powerless to save the person he loves. When he was 10 years old, the same thing happened when he couldn't save his mother from being eaten, and then it happened again when Erwin was brought back to life instead of Armin. On both occasions, Erwin could only watch as his family were taken away from him, but what's especially tragic now is that he still can't prevent it even with his godlike abilities. After explaining all of this to Mikasa, she'd understandably be horrified and super confused. In her mind, the idea that her real body is seconds away from death while her consciousness has been in the past dimension for weeks is something that'd be hard for any human to process. Erwin would try to calm the situation by reassuring her that none of this was her fault, and he'd tell her that he never would have activated the rumbling if he'd known that this would be part of the future. Just like in the main timeline, he wouldn't have seen everything, and so this whole situation would genuinely be catching him by surprise. He'd go on to confess that ever since Armin's death, he's been paranoid about losing her, and that every choice he's made, including the rumbling itself, it was to guarantee that she'd be able to live a long life. Remember, Erwin has known for years that the curse of Ymir was going to kill him one day, and so his goal was to die knowing that Mikasa and the people he cares about would be safe no matter what. Getting emotional, she'd reply by letting him know that she understands, because from the day he gave her that scarf, she's kind of basically felt the same way. We've seen before that Mikasa's biggest fear is Erwin dying, and it's why she always puts everything on the line to save him regardless of how dangerous it happens to be. It could be argued that this overprotectiveness is the main way she expresses her love for him, considering that she's never been explicitly romantic, but in their last moment together, Erwin would finally take the hint as he gives her a kiss. This goodbye smooch is something he'd probably been wanting to do for about 5 years, and he'd hope that by doing it now, it'll allow Mikasa to pass away without any regrets. During the middle of the kiss, the surrounding environment would then suddenly collapse, reverting into the typical blue pause dimension that we're used to seeing. Seconds later, Mikasa would then disappear completely into the void, but what might surprise you is that even with Mikasa being gone, Erwin wouldn't be alone in this dimension. Off in the distance, there'd be someone behind him seemingly tied to a cross, and on closer inspection, the person would turn out to be none other than Flock. For weeks, the Armored Titan has been trapped here in this position, with no way to move his body, no one to talk to, and no idea how he arrived in parts. Although I think he would have tried to stay strong in the beginning, by now the isolation would have mentally broken him down to the point where he'd just be desperate to escape by any means necessary. That's why when Erwin unexpectedly appears in front of him, he'd call out to him for help as if the two of them are somehow still friends. Having just seen Mikasa vanish because of what Flock did, Erwin would angrily turn around, grab him by the neck, and start screaming at him about why he blew himself up. The Armored Titan would try to defend himself by arguing that he didn't have a choice because the scouts were prepared to kill Erwin to stop the rumbling. In particular, he'd highlight the details of Erwin's conversation with Willy Tiber, and he'd point out that the Ackermans are immune from the founding Titan's power. This immunity, combined with their insane combat skills, meant that only Levi or Mikasa would be capable of killing the founder. That being said, Erwin would fight back by telling Flock that Mikasa would never try to kill him, but even if she did, he still want her to have a long and happy life. After all, having already seen Armin be sacrificed for the greater good of the island, Erwin would openly question why everyone he loves has to die in order for Eldia to be free. Flock would simply respond by reminding him that not everyone he cares about is gone. In fact, Connie is back home on the island and doing better than ever after being reunited with Mrs. Springer. This reunion was only possible because Erwin kept relentlessly fighting over the years, and so the Armored Titan would urge him to finish what he started so that Connie and Sasha can have the peaceful lives that Erwin wanted them to have. Interestingly, in spite of everything Flock has done, I think his words would resonate with Erwin because it would remind him that there are still people back home that he needs to protect. If he was going to stop the rumbling now, then it would put all those same people in danger, because the Global Alliance will retaliate, whether it's in 10 years time or even 50 years time. For that reason, following an extremely long pause, Erwin would accept that for the sake of his remaining friends, he does need to finish what he started, but just because he agrees with Flock wouldn't mean that he forgives him. Grabbing him by the shirt one more time, Erwin would describe in detail how he's going to make Flock suffer and die in the worst way imaginable, and with that they'd be transported back into the real world. In this reality, only a handful of seconds would have passed since the Armored Titan exploded, meaning the scouts would still be falling through the smoke. With no one able to save them, their bodies would crash into the ground at full speed, instantly killing both Ackermans and creating a powerful shockwave that could be felt across Liberia. As a side note, given that Historia is a Titan shifter, I highly doubt she'd die from the impact as well, but it'd make sense for her to at least be knocked unconscious. Now, when it comes to Commander Erwin, it's a fact that in 99% of situations, the death of two scouts wouldn't really affect him. Throughout the series, there are countless examples of him either disregarding or gambling with people's lives, and it's why Flock referred to him as the devil himself. The commander has also been described as someone able to abandon his own humanity, but following Flock's betrayal, it'd be hard for Erwin to suppress his true emotions. After everything he and Levi have been through, he just never would have expected humanity's strongest soldier to die at the hands of another scout. What makes it worse is that a year earlier, they were the ones who trusted Flock to be the one to eat Reiner. So for him to now stab them in the back with that same power that they allowed him to have, it'd be super unexpected. In a situation like this, it wouldn't take long for his feelings of sadness and confusion to turn into blinding rage as he reaches out to crush the Armored Titan. Although Flock would be insanely outmatched, he'd still at least raise his fist to defend himself, and just as Erwin is about to deal the finishing blow, he suddenly feels a hand on his shoulder. The hand in question would belong to Erwin, who'd politely tell the commander not to worry about Flock since he already has his own idea for what he wants to do with him. Surprised, Erwin would quickly realize that whatever's happening here must be one of the Founding Titan's tricks, because as he glances around, he noticed that they're frozen in time. Literally nothing except himself and Eren would be able to move inside this dimension, and as the commander looks down, he sees an old memory of Captain Levi. I probably don't need to explain that this specific memory is from 5 years ago, when Levi had to decide who would inherit the Colossal Titan. At the time, Mikasa and Eren quite literally fought for Armin to be the one chosen, whereas everyone else seemed to think that Erwin was the most logical choice. However, in the present day, Eren would now believe that regardless of who was saved, neither Armin or Erwin would have been able to stop the rumbling. The real truth is that as long as subjects of Ymir can become titans at any time, then the rest of humanity will fear them for being monsters. That fear is one of the main reasons why it's so difficult for Eldians and humans to coexist, but until recently, Eren had deluded himself into thinking that Erwin might find a way. Sadly, even the best leader and the best plan wasn't able to find a peaceful solution, and so Eldia's only remaining option is to either destroy humanity or wait for humanity to destroy them. In response, the commander would hesitantly admit that Eren might be right, although there's a reason why he still wouldn't be happy about the rumbling. From his perspective, even if this worldwide massacre succeeds, it's hard to justify sacrificing billions of people for the freedom of their one tiny island. After thinking for a while, he'd remind Eren that when Karl Friss originally trapped Eldians behind the walls, it wasn't only their freedom that he took away. The reality is that subjects of Ymir across the sea also lost their freedom as well, and if it wasn't for their sacrifices, Eren never would have made it this far. For example, people like Grisha, Dinah, and Kruger were all from Liberia, and it was thanks to their actions that Eldians on the island had the tools to survive. Continuing this train of thought, the commander would suggest that subjects of Ymir born outside the walls are no different from them, and so if Eren truly wants Eldians to be free, then that freedom should be extended to Eldians worldwide. Of course, Eren would reply by asking how that would even be possible, to which Erwin would give him a practical solution. As the rumbling continues to march, the founder can transform all these people into pure titans, who can then join him on his rampage across the globe. Once it's all over, they can then start brand new lives on Paradise, but at first, Eren would be majorly skeptical about this plan, given that many Eldians across the sea will hate him for destroying the planet. I think Erwin would also have to acknowledge that possibility, but while it's true that some people won't be happy, there are thousands more who'll be grateful that their families weren't trampled. A proposal like this would be a lot for Eren to process, but after thinking back to his dad's memories, he would accept that maybe the commander has a point. It can't be denied that Eldians from across the sea laid the foundation for everything Eren has achieved, and so for him to turn around and kill people just like them, it would make him no better than the Malians. For that reason alone, he'd agree to play along with Erwin's plan, on the condition that he takes Mikasa's body back home and gives her a proper burial next to Armin. And as the two of them shake hands on it, the scene would flash back to Liberia. On the streets, people would be freaking out as their skin begins to glow yellow, and from Gabby and Falco's perspective, they'd probably think they're about to die. Across the town, thousands of lights would then erupt out of nowhere, as every last man, woman, and child would be transformed into a mindless colossal titan. Standing at 60 meters tall, their explosive transformations would destroy what was left of the city, and interestingly, this same thing would be happening all over the world. In every country where internment zones exist, the Eldians there would unexpectedly turn Titan and would join the rumbling as they trample everything surrounding them. At the same time, while all of this is going on, the Attack Titan would briefly switch his attention to Flock. In the past, we've seen how the people who've betrayed Eren have usually ended up being killed by someone else, but in this instance he'd want to personally deal with the Armored Titan. Having already mentally tortured the guy for weeks, I guess the only thing left to do now would be to physically tear him apart in the real world. To accomplish this, Eren would use the founder to forcibly transform Flock back into his human form, before tossing the body into his own gigantic mouth. As Eren's teeth then rip his former friend to pieces, Flock's screams would be heard for miles as the rumbling continues to move forward. Both the Wall Titans and the Internment Zone Titans would keep marching through the ruins of Liberia, but despite their incredible speed, it would still take them 5 more days for the rumbling to be completed. With the exception of Eldia, every last corner of the earth would be flattened until all that remains would be a barren wasteland filled with the remnants of humanity. Billions of people, entire civilizations, and entire cultures would all be wiped out in less than a week, and this disproportionate act of violence is something that Erwin was selfishly willing to do to protect the handful of people he has left. By the time he then arrives near the shores of the island, Erwin would already be there waiting for him, having made preparations for the internment zone refugees. A few days earlier, in front of a packed courtroom, the commander would explain how Eldia's population has significantly declined during the past decade due to war, famine, and Titan-related incidents. Therefore, the arrival of subjects of Ymir from across the sea could be a great opportunity, especially due to their knowledge of the modern world. Their knowledge of modern medicine and technology could help fill the gap left behind by Hizuru, and it would allow the island to keep advancing for generations to come. Despite that, many people would still be unsure about the large influx of foreigners, including Premier Zachary, who wouldn't really know what to do. Way earlier in this timeline, you might remember that in Part 3, Zachary announced his retirement, with Erwin being selected to replace him at the end of the year. Although the year wouldn't be over, we need to remember that number 1, this character has already fulfilled his main goal as Commander-in-Chief, and number 2, it'd be clear from Erwin's speech that he has a clear vision for how to integrate the refugees. For those reasons, I think Zachary would pretty much have to do the sensible thing and retire early, allowing Premier Smith to have final say on how society moves forward after the rumbling. Flashing forward 18 months, I think a ton of things would have changed on the island by now, especially in the capital city. In the underground, a giant monument to Captain Levi would nearly be completed, with Erwin personally overseeing the construction. For decades, the people of the underground have almost been completely ignored by the royal government, which is partly why the crime there was allowed to get so out of control. Levi himself was a well-known criminal before he joined the Scouts, and if he'd never met Erwin, then it's likely he would have wasted his potential. For that reason, the Commander-in-Chief would want to make sure that people down here have access to better opportunities, which is why, in addition to the statue, the government would make large investments to improve infrastructure and provide various educational programs. Meanwhile, in another area of the capital, Willie Tybur would be locked up in a brand new cell closer to where his family are living. Because the Tyburs have such extensive and valuable knowledge of the modern world and also knowledge of the history of the Eldians, they'd receive a degree of special treatment compared to most refugees. It's how they'd be able to negotiate Willie and Peak being transferred into these better conditions in exchange for the Tyburs cooperating with the military. That being said, at this moment, there still wouldn't be any chance of them being released from prison, which is why Gabby would genuinely be brainstorming ideas for how to break Peak out of her cell. Later that same evening, Colt would give a passionate speech on behalf of Eldians from across the sea, many of whom would be suffering from intense discrimination. It's a fact that many locals on the island would associate the actions of Marley with the people who were coming from over there, and that association would 100% lead to violence against them. This hostility would be similar to how Eldians used to be treated outside the internment zones in Mali itself, and as Erwin and Historia listen to what Cole has to say, they'd realise that the scale of the division is even larger than they first expected. Now, when it comes to how Erwin would adapt to this new world, most of his time would be spent in a forest towards the south of the island. To explain how he ended up here, the first thing we should remember is that he is still a human, and the guilt from killing billions of people and the guilt from getting Mikasa dragged into it, it would weigh heavily on his mind. As time went on, it's unavoidable that he'd feel more and more ashamed about his actions, but what would really mess with his head is that he'd be treated like a hero everywhere he goes. On the streets of Eldia, he'd literally be worshipped for wiping out their enemies, and there isn't a single place he'd be able to go without people glorifying what he did. When you combine that with the severe PTSD he'd be suffering from, eventually Erwin would get so overwhelmed that he'd isolate himself from the rest of society. For almost a year, no one would have any idea where he was, as he'd be living off the land and he'd only ever leave the forest for one reason. Once or twice a month, he'd make the long journey to Gigantina in order to visit that tree on the hill, because underneath this tree is where both Armin and Mikasa would be buried. Every time he'd see them, he'd come to just apologize and ask for their forgiveness, but by pure chance, on one of his visits, Historia would show up a few minutes after him. Despite the garrison searching for Eren for 11 months, this random meeting would be the first time anyone had seen him since his mental breakdown. More than anything, Historia would just be relieved that he's alive, and she'd explain how worried she's been ever since he disappeared. Eren would respond by telling her that she shouldn't waste her energy on a person like him, especially after what he did to her family specifically. However, she just let him know straight away that a lot has changed since that day, and if he's truly sorry, then he'll come back and help them. Confused, Eren would ask what she's even talking about, and this is when she'd tell him about the new crisis on the island. Even within this tiny world, people would rather hold on to the trivial things that used to divide them, rather than embracing the fact that fundamentally they're all the same. Erwin would disregard this by saying that he never expected for the rumbling to suddenly make society perfect, and that the main thing he wanted was for Eldians to be able to live their lives without fear of being wiped out. Historia would argue back that the refugees are living in fear of being wiped out every day, and although Erwin's doing what he can, the hatred they're facing is only getting more and more intense. Many of Erwin's followers and believers are the ones causing the most trouble, and so she'd wonder if maybe he could help change their perspectives if he made a return to society. After a brief pause, he'd explain how he doesn't know if he can, because in his heart he's felt useless ever since the power of the Titans disappeared. 18 months earlier, when the rumbling was complete, the founder Ymir vanished that same day along with all Titan abilities. Whatever she wanted, whether it was revenge on the world or something else, she left once all her descendants made it to the island. It was partly because of this that Erwin slipped into his old mindset where he believed that there was nothing special about him, and that without his powers he had nothing to offer humanity. Surprisingly though, out of nowhere, Historia would suddenly give him a hug, and she just tried to reassure him that what he's saying is completely wrong. Even though she majorly disagrees with him when it came to doing the rumbling, she's seen enough to know that his worth as a human was more than just him turning into a Titan. Regardless of whether he has the power or not, there are still thousands of people out there who believe in him and who'd probably prefer it if he was the one in charge. That comment would cause Erwin to laugh for the first time in over a year, and as he hugs her back, he'd thank her for what she's been trying to do. Historia would reply by asking if that means he'll come back with her, to which he'd just let her know that he's not ready at this point, but that he'd like to arrange for them to meet at this particular spot again. With that said, that is the end of this alternate timeline in which Erwin got the Colossal Titan, and if you've made it this far, then I want to thank you for watching the past 7 videos. I'd appreciate if you guys let me know what were your standout moments from the whole series that you liked the best. I gotta say, for me personally, my top 3 moments were Erwin using the Warhammer Titan to its full potential. Another thing was Historia summoning Erwin to the past dimension. I think that was probably my favorite plot twist in the whole thing, and Flock betraying Mikasa was also pretty cool as well. Anyway, thanks again for sticking around for the 17 months that it's taken me to complete this timeline, and yeah, be sure to subscribe if you want more what if content like this. Until the next one,